Hello everybody, my name is Archaeopteryx and we're back here with Jason, and we're just continuing our ARCHOSAURIA segment, well, I would say sub-segment, which is part of our major segment called the Reptilia. If you are new here, please make sure, obviously, to subscribe and to check out the previous installments of this Reptilia line of videos that we have been making together. So far there's been only two, and I'll link them below in the description box. Now with that out of the way, hey Jason, welcome back. It's only been about, what, a week or something? So how are you?
Doing well. Excited to keep on going with this.
Okay, well, since you are so excited, why don't we just get right to it and spare all the nonsense? So, uh, what are we doing today? Are we doing birds, aren't we? Because that's another
Yes.
major part of the Archosauria, from the extant line at least, that we need to look at.
Yes.
And we have, what do we have on the screen, by the way? Can you describe to us what this bird is and why did we decide to start with this one in particular?
This is an osprey, so it's one of the birds of prey. So, if you will, the true raptors. So kind of like a hawk. Just wanted to, have a good image to show for birds. So went with one of the dynamic images. A lot of dynamic images for birds. So not too hard there. I will say that this whole series has been interesting because when it was originally pitched, we were just thinking about a simple, like, let's just go through a review of Reptilia and talk about this and that. And it was meant to be, I think, just one video. And as things were getting in place and we started talking about it, like that first video wound up covering just one or two groups of animals. And we're like, okay, this is gonna have to be two videos. And then we did the second video on Archosaurs last time, and we focused on the croc line, and that wound up taking up all the time too. So each video has kind of gotten longer and longer while focusing on smaller and smaller groups. So in hindsight, we probably should have thought about that ahead of time because there's just so much to talk about. Hopefully, it hasn't been too meandering and people have been enjoying it. But this will round us out for all the living animals today. So we're going to talk about birds.
Sure.
Um,
I wanted to also add to this that once
yeah.
we get to the extinct ones, we might even potentially sort of rewind back a little bit and go back to, say, some of the lepidosaurs and testudians, specifically focusing on the extinct groups of them and
Yeah.
their relatives, in order to basically explore those groups. And since I'm getting pretty addicted to this format of this series, I'm actually considering to eventually start going into the smaller groups, if you will, of some animals, and how small and how in depth we're gonna go into that will probably just depend on a variety of things, since obviously I'm not necessarily seeking popularity per se, but I do like the idea of just having something that, is gonna be out there and available in case somebody just wants to listen to useful information, or at least that's what I like to think.
Yeah, and I think this can serve as a nice little like series of reference videos because we talk about a lot of broad subjects in each individual group. So there's potential for people to come back and like look for time-stamped different bits, which comes in handy.
Perfect.
Yeah, so today we're talking about birds. It's a group Aves. If we have the old cladogram image from last time, we could
The
bring
black
that up.
and white image.
Yeah.
Sure thing. Let's just give me a few seconds and I'll bring it right up. There it is. It's ready
Yeah,
for you.
so once again, this is kind of rounding us out, right? So we can see in our cladogram, we've covered our testodines, we've done our lepidosaurs, we did the Pseudotsuchian group, so it's our group that led to our crocodilians. Don't know why I didn't say crocodilia there. And then we're going to do the ornithodyrans, which again, since we're just focusing on birds or aves, could have just said aves, but that's fine. But that'll flesh out the rest of our modern day animals. And again, this is that monophyletic definition of reptilia, so Sauropsida, which is why we are bringing birds into the fold. And plus, since especially a lot of the viewers of your channel are very interested in dinosaurs, it's hard not to talk about dinosaurs without bringing in birds, because birds are such an integral part to the dinosaur story.
Exactly. And I do think that it's a very interesting thing that you've mentioned, how basically this diagram shows us the all of the living extant animals, right here.
Right.
Yet there is only one of them, Synapsidae, that is odd one out, while everything else in here, at least, is basically Reptilia. And of course, we are not including, I presume we're not including others because they are not part of the Amniota. Am I pronouncing it right?
Yes, yeah. Like, so you're not seeing amphibians on there because they're out of amniotes. So they did their own thing before amniotes formed. There are some other animals that are in the amniote group between like our synapsids or mammals and then our reptiles, and they're the sort of wishy-washy, not sure where they fit amniotes that are their own thing, but they're all dead, so they're all extinct. So they don't show up on this because this is basically, if you will, the cladogram of winners, as in the ones that all are still alive today, right? So everything you're seeing in that image is not extinct.
Right. Of course, we're not obviously going too deep into the fact that some members of these living groups have gone extinct too, but the groups themselves are still around in general.
Right. So the lineage continues, even though it's peppered with the bodies of former species.
Exactly.
That's just kind of how evolution works. It's,
so what are the important things?
Large body count.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead. What was it?
Large body count to that. Yeah. So this video is going to be a little different from the previous videos,
Right.
in part because this is now our third time doing the same format, so we're definitely a lot more prepared. So it should feel a little bit more polished than previous videos. Apologies to previous videos. That's usually
Hopefully.
how it goes. But also because we're dealing with birds, and that kind of changes the game a little bit, because we have that, was it the totality of knowledge image I brought up? If we think about all we know about animals, and if we could take everything we know about some groups of animals and just condense it down into one written piece, like into some kind of literature, then in terms of relative knowledge, all the stuff we talked about with reptiles, including the crocodile stuff, would fit on a standard like trifold pamphlet or brochure that you would get like at a doctor's office or at a visitor center. But when we move to birds, people like birds, and birds are a lot, in some ways, easier to study. So we have a lot more knowledge about birds. So if our totality of knowledge for birds were condensed into this one piece of literature, it could fill up, like a large size magazine, like Forbes magazine or something like that, which is a pretty thick magazine.
Pretty thick one, yeah.
Then you go on to mammals, and humans like mammals, so we have a lot of information on mammals. That could probably take up a textbook or two. And then finally, if we just focused on humans, obviously that's where most studies have gone. Like before science, after science, that's where most studies tend to go, is on human knowledge. So we have a whole library of knowledge on how humans work. We are the animal that we know the most about.
So do we basically conclude that humans like other humans very much? Or shall we just say we just like some humans?
I mean, humans, they do focus more on other humans. I think that if we lived in a parallel universe where dolphins were the technologically advanced species, or ants or squid, then they would take up the library, right? I think that just there's a tendency for animals to be more interested in animals more similar to them.
So how
and
about
because of that,
some fan art, for the super advanced dolphins and squids and ants? If you guys who are listening want to try that, feel free to post that in the art Discord thread as well. Just okay, don't make it too weird though, just so you know, because, well, anyway, carry on, Jason. Sorry.
I do feel like you walk a fine line right there.
Very fine line. I know. I just realized it. That's why I decided to quickly push on a break.
But yeah, so in general, right, we focus a lot on humans because we're human.
Sure.
And then we're interested in things that are more close to humans, so we go a little bit further back. Okay, we're interested in other mammals because that's us. And then we're interested in birds because birds share a lot in common with mammals, even though they're not really that closely related to them. And then you get further and further away, and there's less knowledge available because there's less, unfortunately, interest in it. Which is kind of this roundabout way of saying that, well, we're doing the reptile stuff before. We're doing lepidosaurs, testudines, we're doing our crocodilians. It takes a lot more effort to find all the really interesting tidbits of information. When we start doing bird stuff, now it's a lot easier to find this information. So there's a lot of information we know about birds. There's still a lot we don't know, but that's true about everything. But in terms of, in comparison to other reptile groups, birds we know the most about.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Would you happen to know, in terms of rough percentage or the amount of total species on the planet, how much of that chunk do birds specifically make up as of alive today?
I can give you a number of species that are known. As for relative chunk, it gets a little harder. But yeah, let's jump into that, right? So birds, class Aves, very successful group today. There's about 11,000 or so species that have been named. So 11,000 species that are roughly known. And when we compare them to just amniotes, that makes them either the most speciose group today or the second most, because they're kind of going neck and neck with the paraphyletic reptilia right now, right? So the reptilia that I'm more used to using. So if we just think of the lizards, snakes, turtles, and crocodilians as their own thing, then that group is, at the moment, there's a little more species of those than there are of birds, but they're very close to each other right now. So 11,000 species. Actually, if you have that cladogram, we could bring that up.
Sure. Give me
It's a
2
really
seconds.
long cladogram.
It's the one that is more vertically stretched with a bunch of trees, which unfortunately is going to be difficult to see. So do you want me to zoom in on a specific color code of the tree? In order
Nope.
to...
We're just going for shock and awe here. Just
Okay.
show this. Like, this is the avian family tree. So of all the birds alive today. So like I said, about 11,000 species that are known. It's broken up into 41 different orders of birds and about 250 different bird families. So it is taxonomically very diverse. Unlike in herpetology, so the study of birds the study of reptiles and amphibians, there is more of an oversplitting problem in birds. So a lot of ornithologists are more willing to say that this species and this species are not only different species, but maybe different genera, different families, possibly even toss them into a different order. There's a lot of bird families that just have one animal in them, like one species in them. So there's some, if there's taxonomic revision to be done in aves, it's probably going to be more of a lumping and sort of culling of some of this stuff. Whereas in the reptile group, because there's so much still unknown, there tend to be a little bit more push to split things, even though herpetologists are really comfortable with lumping critters into the same group. So a thing to think about, but the overall point is, birds super diverse. A large part of the reason why birds are so diverse is because they can fly, right? If you can fly, you can reach different areas that are hard for other animals to get to. The ability to go over mountains and tree tops, to go over large bodies of water, really increases your dispersal capability, which gives a lot of birds very large habitat ranges, but also offers the opportunity for them to colonize different areas and to speciate into many different species, right? So if we just return it to mammals for a second, right, the most speciose group of mammals today are going to be our bats, or actually it's going to be our rodents, but then after that it's going to be our bats. And bats, again, part of the reason for them being so speciose is probably because they can fly, so they can go from different places and just tackle a bunch of different niches that are just not available to animals that can only walk along the ground. So, very diverse group of critters.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, we're using the monophyletic definition of Reptilia to include birds in that. And that's something that has been considered for a while. So way back in the 1800s, Thomas Henry Huxley, so Darwin's bulldog, like his biggest sort of proponent, was the one to coin the phrase, or was the first person to really bring this to light by calling birds just glorified reptiles, right? So he recognized that there are reptilian characteristics of birds, but we tend to overlook it because of the fact that they're covered in feathers and they're very boisterous and many of them are loud, and so they're very just in your face, which makes them feel more like mammals. So they kind of get a lot of the same attention that we get with mammals, but really they're much more in that reptile line.
I see. So, yeah, this is very interesting, because I always had this view that, because obviously, as you said, we tend to know more about mammals generally than we do about any other group of animals. I always was under the impression that mammals were, initially at least, that means a long time ago, when I first started getting into learning about animals in general, I was under the impression that mammals made up the vast majority of animals on the planet, and then it started to kind of shatter slowly. That idea started to slowly disillusion, if you will, when I started realizing how many species of birds we have as well. So I guess I don't even know where to begin. I mean, is there any particular tree here on this big cladogram that you wanted to delve deeper into, or this was just mainly for like a very general scope of things, if you will?
Yeah, largely just for general scope. It might still come in handy to look back on every now and then, because this does cover a lot of the different groups that we are covering.
Sure.
We're just seeing, yeah, so we have, I have to wonder why I'm looking at that one. There we go. Yeah, so a lot of different groups to look at. They have it broken up into the sort of major different groups. We might come back to it.
Sure.
But we'll see. Yeah.
So in our traditions, where do we normally start? Do we start with what basically, let's just say like this, what makes a bird, and how do we go in terms of anatomy? Like, what are the main characteristics that we need to look at, and which image, obviously, would you like to start from to dissect it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if we were to look at distinguishing characteristics of birds, the big one is going to be feathers, right? So feathers are that hallmark of birds. It's what was originally used to distinguish birds from mammals, from reptiles. So way back when Carolus Linnaeus was doing taxonomy, even before all that, it was pretty clear that you could separate animals based on one or two very large shared characteristics. So for birds, it was feathers. For mammals, it was hair and the fact that they lactate their young. But yeah, so feathers, very complicated integumentary appendages, right? So they sit on top of the epidermis, or they grow out of the epidermis. But they are comprised of multiple different structures. So you got the rachis, you got the barbs, you have the little barbules, so a sort of hook and loop situation. It makes feathers very complicated. Also makes them work really well at insulating. So they're good at holding in, or holding in a layer of air between the skin and the environment, which is a cushion to prevent heat loss, but also to prevent excess heat from getting into the body. So just like the way a thermos works.
Right.
And then, of course, a lot of those feathers function really good as an airfoil, right? So they're really good at acting, or at moving air over the top of the feather better than the bottom, so creating lift, allowing birds to fly, to glide and to fly. Or yes, so definitely a big deal about birds.
Osprey image for now, just so that we can talk about feathers while we look at it as well, because it has a very nice quality of image of them as well. So
yeah, and we could look up for a specific image for a feather if we want, but I mean, that's like the big deal, and we could do a whole And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if it happens. I think we kind of did in the first interview, like a whole thing on feathers.
Yes, that
Right?
was
Because
the
feathers.
second part of our first sort of interview when we first introduced you to this community and the channel.
Yes, so you can go back and see that video if you want to learn more about the feather stuff.
Oh yeah, there is a lot.
But yes, so related to feathers, of course, there's the flight, right? The fact that so many birds fly. Most birds alive today fly. And that's the thing that's really attracted their attention to people, because people like the idea of flying, and we spent so long trying to fly, and now we can fly to a degree, and that like you can just look at how many superheroes have flying capabilities. Like, we've definitely always liked the idea of flight. Birds could fly, so that immediately grabs our attention. We want to know how they can fly, what it is they're doing that makes it possible for them to fly. A lot of that information was used to then lead us to our modern day aerodynamics and flying. But yeah, so they're the most obvious flying animals today. They are the fourth group of animals to learn how to fly. Right? Not fourth like in a specific lineup, but of the animals alive today, like we have insects that figured out how to fly. We have birds that figured out how to fly. There's bats. And then in the extinct realm, we have pterosaurs. So there's like the four main groups that figured out how to fly.
Sure.
Of course, allows birds to cover great distances. Like I said before, fill in different niches that are not available for other animals to fill in. In general, yeah, so that's kind of the big deal with like birds is the feathers, the flight, and then the last thing is that birds are endothermic. They are warm-blooded, so in the same way that mammals are. So because of that, there is almost, I think, like a feeling of kinship, I guess, with birds that humans seem to feel, that also interests us. So birds are doing stuff that seems very similar to how mammals do stuff. And for a while, and I have to look up the name of the person who originally coined the phrase, but there was a hypothesis going around that birds and mammals shared a common ancestor much closer than they actually do, and that is why both groups are endothermic, right? So it was called the hematothermia. It turns out that is not true at all, and that, or at least the data does not support that really at all, and that the way birds came across endothermy is different from the way mammals did, so they both just converged on doing this. But because of that, there are a lot of things that birds do that are also similar to what mammals do, right? So they use a non-shivering thermogenesis, so a means of not having to use their muscles to actually warm up their bodies. They have very high basal metabolic rates, so that's the minimum amount of energy needed to keep them running. It's about 30 to about 40% higher in a bird than it is in a similar sized mammal, so they're not too far off, but birds do tend to run a little bit hotter. And then there are other things we think about with birds that tend to be associated with birds that gets a little more variable. Before we jump into that, I'm going to dial us back a bit. So if we think about our first bird, and it occurs to me I probably should have brought up an image of that one too, so I might just grab one of those while we're talking. But, you know, if we think about our first bird, the first bird is currently is Archaeopteryx. Right, so we're all, especially on this channel, probably well aware of Archaeopteryx.
Yep, everybody knows about Archaeopteryx, and we know for a fact that this is indeed the first bird, right?
I don't know if I would say we know for a fact that it is, because if that is a little too...
Do we know for a fact that it is actually a bird, and not just a very, let's just say, highly specialized dinosaur of some kind? As in, like, non-avian dinosaur, if you will.
Yeah, here we go. Let me just toss that in there. It's just something for people to look at. Okay, so Archaeopteryx. So Archaeopteryx originally discovered in 1860. So about a year or so after Darwin's publishing of The Origin of Species. Archaeopteryx received a lot of attention, in part because just as the hypothesis of evolution via natural selection was starting to get heated, and people were really starting to debate whether or not this was a real thing. Archaeopteryx comes along, and we have this almost poster child for like the classic transitional fossil, because here is a bird. Obviously, it's a bird because it has feathers, but it also has teeth, like you see in reptiles, and it has a long tail.
It has
So
multiple digits as well.
Yes, you can see the multiple digits. So, when we look at modern birds, we don't see. You can still see multiple digits, but everything is a lot more fused together. But here with Archaeopteryx, you had this animal that kind of just looks like this perfect mix between a bird and a reptile, and so because of that, it received a lot of airplay. It's been a few centuries now with this, and we've routinely returned to Archaeopteryx to see whether or not it really warrants the title of first bird. And so far, it has withstood the test of time. There was a brief moment a few years back, might be closer to 15 years back, where Archaeopteryx was coming out as not a bird anymore, but just outside of birds, as in this Paravian group, which is still in that dinosaur, bird-like dinosaur area. It's has not lasted. It's still controversial. It kind of hops a little bit in and out, but it's mostly still falling in line with birds. And then part of the reason why it will probably always stay a bird, if not the first bird, is that there have been definitions of aves in the past that kind of hinge on Archaeopteryx as their anchor point. So it kind of locks Archaeopteryx in there as a bird regardless. Though saying all that, even if it winds up not being the first bird, which, I mean, it's doubtful it was the first bird, it's pretty close to that origin. And it's showing how dinosaurs went from land-dwelling theropods to these more flight-based animals. And so the animal itself, Archaeopteryx, lived around 150 million years ago, so that we could kind of nail down at close to when birds first appeared. So aves as a group probably showed up sometime in that 150 million year territory. Could probably dial it back another 10, 20 million years as like roughly somewhere in there when we could say that an animal that was a dinosaur eventually became an animal that was a bird.
Is there any particular working hypothesis out there which would give us any kind of information regarding what pushed to this sort of split and evolutionary branch?
That's a tough one. It's an area of lots of study, because it is a question that drives a lot of paleontologists, a lot of dinosaur paleontologists. They want to know why some groups of dinosaurs took to the air and became birds. Like, what was the evolutionary pressure to do so, especially given that this was a time period where pterosaurs were flying all over the place. So it's not like it was an empty field. Like, any dinosaur that was going in there was going into an area that was already pretty well established with pterosaurs, so there was going to be competition. But whatever it was, it led to one group of dinosaurs and going on to become birds and just exploding out to do a bunch of other stuff. Whether or not they did it as arboreal animals that jumped from the trees and glided down, or if they were running along the ground and were using more of a wing-based assisted running technique and then took off into the air that way, is currently unknown. Might never be known. That's a tough one to crack. It's also hard to find really good fossils for early birds that far back in time. So a lot of our knowledge of bird evolution still comes from early Cretaceous period stuff and not so much late Jurassic. That's just kind of an issue. We really lucked out with Archaeopteryx because it happened to be in the Zonhofen, what do you call it? Zonhofen beds, which is basically just like old, like really low energy anoxious lake beds. So really good at preserving the animals with portions of their integument intact. Because as has been pointed out in other videos and other literature, if you strip the feathers off Archaeopteryx, it's really easy to have it confused with something like Coelophysis. Not Coelophysis, the other one, Compsognathus.
Compsognathus, yeah.
Yeah, so there you can definitely see the dinosauria aspects of birds when you look at Archaeopteryx. Part of the reason that we bring that up is because a lot of what we associate with birds today, because there really is a large gulf between a bird and a dinosaur when you start with the birds of today. Because the first birds of today, the first modern birds, are in this group called Neorenathis, so the new birds. And every bird alive today is a descendant in that Neorenathian group. And they started around that mid-early Cretaceous period. So we're already jumping tens of millions of years closer to the present day before we really see animals that you would, without a doubt, think that is a bird. And these are the animals that have toothless beaks, right? So there's no teeth in their beak. They have beaks for starters, and they have no teeth in their mouth. There's no more tail, so all the tail is just pygostyle, so a fused set of tail vertebrae that has a tail fan on it. Fused distal limb bones, so this is where we start to see that tarsimetatarsus come into play, which is a mix of the ankle bones and the sort of the foot bones. So they form this really long shaft in birds, which is what gives birds that almost looks like their knees are bent backwards, but it's really just their really long ankle bones. And then other things like the way they move their heads around. So a lot of modern birds do a lot of head bobbing. That's related to their very large eyes, which limits the ability of their extraocular muscles to move their eyes around as they move. So it's hard for those muscles to maintain stability and gaze. So they do a lot of head bobbing to offset it. It's something called a vestibulocolic reflex.
I have a question in this case.
Yeah.
Do we have any evidence or any kind of testable data to come close to determining whether dinosaurs or whichever groups of dinosaurs had a similar condition, if you will?
The head bobbing thing.
Yes, basically related to that issue that you just explained.
If any dinosaur bobbed their head, it would have been convergent with what we see in birds, because I'm trying to remember her name. But I have to look it up again. But yeah, there's studies on the evolution of head bobbing in birds suggest that it does show up sometime in Neorenathis. So somewhere deep in that group is when we start to really see head bobbing as a thing. So if other dinosaurs were doing that, then they were doing that like they had evolved it on their own. If the reason for head bobbing is because the extraocular muscles don't have enough room to move the eyes around, then it's probable that very, very few dinosaurs, if any, would have head bobbed, because most of them have enough space in their head to move their eyes around. It is pretty crazy. If you remember that bird picture that we showed last time when we were showing the antorbital fenestra, bird eyes are just huge. I've worked on ostriches in the past, and when you do a CT scan through an ostrich skull, there's almost no bone separating one eyeball from the next eyeball, so they're pretty much touching each other. Their eyes are so big. So birds really, really went with it with eyes. Like, that is the direction they went on that.
Seems to me like it's a very big investment on an evolutionary part into the eyes when it comes to birds, isn't it?
Yes, they're a very visual group of animals, so they put a lot of investment into eyes. They do also have a pretty good sense of hearing. So most bird hearing does still fall within the range that we see with other reptiles, where you're looking in the low frequency range with just a little bit of a foray into the higher frequencies. But there are a few species, especially like in owls, where you have ears that have adapted to hearing at higher frequencies, which makes sense for owls because owls use their ears to hunt at night and to listen to the sounds of little mice moving through the underbrush. So having a higher sense of hearing comes in handy there. It was thought for the longest time that birds also have a bad sense of smell because so much of their eyes have eaten up the space where their nose was. So the part of the nose that is dedicated to smell has largely atrophied in a lot of, or has just been shrunk down in a lot of these birds. But then work from Betsy Bang in the late 60s and early 70s started putting a kibosh on that, and really looked at the shape of the nasal airways inside different bird species, and they found that a lot of birds still retain a lot of space to separate odors and to have a pretty good sense of smell. And there are birds today that actually do have phenomenal senses of smell, which, again, viewers of the channel are thus familiar with all of the Jurassic Park franchise, so you're all probably well aware of the whole turkey vulture bit. So turkey vultures have a very good sense of smell. They're really good at smelling carrion from miles away. And if we look inside the nose of a turkey vulture, we can see large spirals in the shape of the soft tissue inside the nose that's dedicated to sifting out odors. So some birds definitely still have a really good sense of smell. A lot of other birds, especially in the songbird area, it's not as good, and it's much more reduced. But also birds just, if we're going to put one special sense above all the rest, I'd say most birds went down the visual route, so focusing a lot on vision. Yeah, so Neorenathis, that's where all the modern birds are today, and that started about the mid to early Cretaceous period. Funnily enough, that's roughly around the same time that we get Eusuchia, so it's kind of interesting how the modern crocs and the modern birds both started out roughly around the same time. I'm pretty certain that is just coincidence, but it's interesting to point out nonetheless.
I wanted to ask you something in regards to birds. Well, since we started with the anatomy, I was going to suggest, why don't we try to explain some of the basics first and then start getting into the nitty-gritty bits. So obviously we have established that flight is an important aspect of birds, even though there are some birds that do not fly, which, if I'm correct, are generally considered to be an exception of the rule. Am I right or not on that part?
Well, yeah, so it's interesting you bring that up. Flight is definitely the most obvious feature of birds, even more so than feathers. Flight is plesiomorphic, so it's an ancestral characteristic that was inherited by all Neorenathians. So even every bird alive today that doesn't fly has descended from an ancestor that did fly. And despite, as you said, the fact that we think about birds as flying, there are, a lot of instances where birds have lost their flight ability. They become secondarily flightless. Now you think about like the big ratites or the paleonaths, right? So you think ostriches and emus, like those are the big ones that can't fly. Or maybe you think like chickens and turkeys, which domestic ones don't fly very well. Wild turkeys can fly for a little bit, but they're burst flyers, so they can fly long enough to get up into a tree, and then that's about it. But yeah, a lot of birds did wind up losing their ability to fly, and this has happened as estimated somewhere between 35 to maybe 150 times throughout the lineage just since Neorenathians. So flight seems to be readily lost in birds, and that might be because even though flight gives you access to all these different niches and gives you this really wide dispersal capability, it's also really expensive, and it really limits what you can do, right? So other aspects of birds that are unique to them are that they don't have a lot of fat on them, because fat takes up space, even though it's a lot of useful energy. If you're trying to fly, that's going to be extra weight that you have to deal with. There's a lot of weight-saving features that we see in birds, or at least a lot of features that seem related to weight saving. Some stuff like loss of a tail, loss of teeth, that's probably not weight saving because you're not really saving that much weight. But the hollowing out of the bones, even though birds descended from dinosaurs that already had hollowed out bones, birds took the hollowing out to a whole new level and hollowed out so much of their skeleton. There are some birds like hummingbirds and other songbirds where if you do a CT scan of their skull, actually if you can do it with ostriches, their skulls look like it's made out of bubble wrap. Like there's just so many little holes all throughout the skull that's just filled with air. So really, birds did extreme measures to lighten their skeleton, which is the heaviest part of the body that they have to deal with.
I wanted to talk more about the flight ability itself right now, if it's possible to get into it. And specifically, I wanted to ask, so aside from the weight-saving tendency and evolutionary path that you have just described, what else would enable them to take flight, given that obviously birds, as you have correctly pointed out, are extremely diverse group of animals, and this implies that the sizes and shapes, anatomy of their feathers would have been also pretty diverse. This would also imply that the length and width of their wingspans would also be quite diverse. And their tail fans, and their shapes and lengths as well, would have been quite diverse. So what exactly, in your opinion, or based on some of the knowledge that you might have at your disposal, in this case, would you be able to direct us to understand how they actually were able to fly? And then, of course, as a quick follow-up, if that's not too much in one go, what made other birds that are flightless lose their ability to flight as a result?
Okay. So the big thing that lets birds fly, aside from the feathers and the wings, is and the shape of the feathers, right? So the feathers need to be asymmetrical, so they have to have a leading edge to them, so a thinner spot or a thicker spot where you encourage air to go over one side of the wing versus the other. So you ever seen like a shape of a wing? It's kind of like a teardrop shape. It's kind of that shape. So birds have to have that in place. They also have to have the power to do it. So right, birds flap, so they have to have really strong muscles that let them flap. And so the muscles that let you flap are the same muscles that let you do a bench press, right? So that's like the big chest muscles, so those pectoralis muscles. So in birds, those muscles are really huge. And then the muscles that lift the arms back up are also pretty large. And interestingly, unlike a bat or a human, where when we want to lift our arms back, we use muscles that are on our backs, birds actually use muscles that are also on their chest, and through a fancy little pulley system are able to pull their wings up by contracting muscles on their chest. All of that takes up space and needs to be able to pull against something. So it's going to pull on the humerus, which is that big arm bone in the beginning, so that the first major arm bone you have, and it's going to pull on the sternum. So that's the bone that's protecting your heart, right? So in humans, our sternum is there. It's fine. It's not very large, and ribs attached to it. But in birds, the sternum is massive. It's this giant thing. So in fact, if we want, we can go ahead and bring that in there. It's, if you want to look at that image of the color-coded
Yep, got it.
skeleton. So this is from, I think this is a chicken skeleton. This one is related to, kind of showing the scapula and coracoid in as their own thing. But the blue, the structure in blue there, that's the sternum in a bird, right? So in a flying bird, the sternum is this giant shield-shaped structure that has a really large keel in it, right? So like a kind of like a dorsal fin, except it's facing downward, or it's like the keel of a boat, right? So it's really large crest on the middle of the sternum, and that's where all of these large chest muscles and even some of that back muscle is attaching. So you need to have that ability to flap your wings for a long time and also to generate enough force with those wings. So that's where all that area is taken up. When you get breast meat on a chicken or a turkey, right, you're pulling it off of that sternum, and that's all that wing flapping muscle. You need to be lightweight, because even if you have the strongest muscle in the world, that muscle is going to be heavy. And so if you're too heavy, you're going to have trouble getting off the ground anyway, right? It's considered a payload issue, right? So there's only so much that those wings can carry. The size of the wings are going to matter. So is something called wing loading, right? So it's the amount of weight per surface area on the wing that animal can carry. So the wider the wing, the larger the wings, the wider they are, the lower the wing loading, the easier it is to get in the air. So if you think of condors, so the really large vultures, or actually, since we have it on here, if you want to bring up that albatross image.
The albatross, the one that's...
mighty albatross.
Yeah.
So that's a great albatross flying over the ocean, because that's what albatross do. But they have the largest wingspan of any bird alive today. So they go up to about 11 feet, so about 3.5 meters in length. And their wing loading is so low that these birds have to take... They use a running start to get into the air, but they only flap their wings like a handful of times, like 3-4 times before they get in the air. And then once they're in the air, because they're over the ocean, where there's nothing to stop wind from just constantly moving, they can be like flying around the ocean for a year or two at a time and maybe never flap their wings, or maybe flap their wings once or twice, because they just can glide from place to place and just use that wind to keep them in the air. And that's because they have such low wing loading.
So basically, this big wingspan also affects the frequency of the flaps as well, that is required in order to keep them in the air.
Yes, and it works out well, because the larger and larger your wings are, the slower you're gonna be able to flap anyway, because there's so much inertia there. So you couldn't ever flap wings like that very fast. Vultures do the same thing that our albatross there is doing. They use thermals, so convective currents of heat basically rising from the ground to just keep themselves flying in the air, and they'll just ride those thermals, and they'll just go from a thermal to thermal looking for food, and basically almost never have to flap their wings. And because they have such a low wing loading, it's really easy for them to get in the air. If anything, they have to worry about like accidentally opening their wings during a windy day, because they could just start flying on accident. And in contrast, if you compare that to your average songbird, like a cardinal or a robin, they have much higher wing loading because they have these shorter wings. So you see them flapping their wings really hard all the time. They almost look like little bullets moving through the air. If you ever see them flying, where they'll flap a couple times and just kind of glide as these just little like weird little rocks, and then they'll open their wings again and fly again.
I've observed the sparrows. You know the common sparrow, obviously. It's a very widespread bird all around the world, I'm sure. Especially in Eurasia, I know for a fact that there's so many of them everywhere. And
yeah, they were introduced to the States too. Yeah, they're all over here.
Yep, yeah, they're over there as well. Okay. And the reason actually I think I know this is because our common friend and colleague, if you will, in your case colleague, and in my case a moderator of the channel and the server, Jeffrey, he has basically referred to it in one of his joking sort of rant responses to something in a scientific manner. Like he used the scientific term for it, and it took me a while to realize that he actually referred to a common sparrow. Which, by the way, I don't even remember what its name is as a matter of fact. But in any case, the main thing I wanted to say is that I've observed them for quite a long time, and I notice how they do this burst of flaps, and then eventually, as they gain the altitude, they interrupt it, and as they sort of lower a little bit, they do another round of flaps, and they kind of go in the amplitude type of, wavy pattern. If you were to draw a line and trace a line after their movements in the sky.
Yes. I guess, yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, it's like these smaller birds with their smaller wings. They have they almost use a brute force approach to get into the air. They just like force their way up there. But yeah, so flying requires, you have to be light enough, and you have to be strong enough, and you have to have enough surface area that is roughly the right shape to keep yourself in the air. So that's how birds pull it off, in a very general sense, and that does, like I said, limit them to not being able to get too heavy, and and yeah, just focus a lot on weight-saving features, right? So they can't carry a lot of fat on them. They do tend to digest food pretty fast, so that way they convert the food they need pretty fast, so it's not sitting in their stomach too long.
What about this other thing
Which is
that
a
I was
big one.
curious? When they fly, this is one of the things I never really knew for sure, but I wonder if you know or aware of. Do birds in any way experience turbulence? Or if they do, how would that affect their flight? Or is it so because it's not as, because they're not themselves as big to actually experience this difference of the airflow or density to the point that it would affect their flight in that sense? So maybe they don't really notice it. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, birds will experience turbulence. Air itself, just like on a windy day, will be turbulent. But if birds are flying in a group, there is the risk of suffering because as they flap, they're going to create turbulent eddies behind them that are going to mess up the air for anything that's flying behind them. So that's what results largely in that V-shaped formation you often see birds flying in, is them taking advantage of where they're starting to knock off these vortexes or vortices, where they're creating turbulence, and these other birds avoiding that pathway and just riding the area that's much more laminar, easier to fly through flow. Because yeah, the biggest problem with turbulence is it's chaotic. Sometimes you'll run into a patch of turbulence where the air is moving up and it's helping you get up, and other times you're going to run into a patch of turbulence where the air is moving down and it's going to be pushing you down, and so it's easy to lose control and get a bit of a rough ride. So just like with an airplane, birds do their best to avoid getting into turbulent air when they can.
Well, lucky, like, at least according to what I know, that turbulences are almost never the sole reasons for plane accidents, in case any viewers here are afraid of flying or experience it and get scared when they're flying. But it's just that the bigger the wings and the plane itself is, the less likely you will feel the effect of the said turbulence whenever you are in there, because meaning obviously you might be jumping up and down a couple meters at least, or maybe tens of meters, who knows, in the altitude, which is why you will definitely feel like you are either falling or you're climbing too rapidly. But in the grand scheme of things, as a flight path itself, you will probably you don't really notice it that much. It's a bit like going on the waves, or when a train carriage is kind of, on these springs, it's kind of bouncing a little bit, sometimes a bit too much, sometimes a bit less. And birds then experience it very much the same way, right?
Yeah, it's the same deal. And just like a pilot, they will do their best to avoid flying in a turbulent wake. The way the birds fly is very similar to the way that fish swim, in part because water and air are both fluids. It's just the density that changes. So, I mean, it's the density and some of the makeup, but the density is the big deal. But the same patterns apply. Like fish don't swim in turbulent water if they can avoid it, so they'll
That is a
swim
good
in
point,
the
yes.
flooded birds or of fish, because it tends to be a little easier for swimming that way. It's a little easier for flying if you can stay out of that turbulent area, but you can also get a bit of a pick me up if you stay right near the around the shedding portion, the shedding zone, so you can get like a bit of a boost.
And
Which is
am
what you're
I-
seeing with the whole V-shaped thing in birds, or in groups.
It's,
Birds
it's
flying.
obviously fascinating that they're aware of it to the point where they can actually deploy these kind of tactics of group flight, because they obviously understand that, okay, if we do this, that's not gonna be very good and convenient for us, so let's actually try to rearrange it, and they come up with this somehow, these different ideas of how they do it, which is in itself very fascinating. And the other thing that I
It's
wanted, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a variation of complexity theory. That basically it's not a conscious decision on the birds. I mean, there might be a bird or two that thinks about it, but they don't have to think about it. If it's literally a thing that it's a pattern that forms because the birds realize that if they fly behind this bird, they're going to have a lot of trouble, and they're going to be flapping their wings a lot. But if they fly a little bit more to the side of that bird, then they don't have to flap their wings as much, and they can almost get a free ride out of it. So think about it as being like almost like being lazy. You're just like, okay, this region of this bird I'm flying behind sucks, but this region is great.
It's a path
It's
of
kind of
least
like when you see,
resistance.
yeah, it's like when you see whales and dolphins riding in the wake of boats, right? It's the same deal. Like they don't ride right behind the boat, but they'll ride around the sides,
Hmm.
and they'll get a free ride out of it.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. And the other thing that I also wanted to ask in this case, do open, even sort of, or even-ish kind of areas favor a less turbulent air, meaning better conditions for a nicer, more enjoyable flight?
Uh, a lot of it depends on the winds, on the speed the air is moving, and how many things the air bumps into. All right, so if there's not a lot of things for air to bump into, it can be much more orderly flow. But if the air is moving really fast, then there's going to be portions of the airfield that are able to move faster than others, and things start to, and then other parts of the airfield that kind of just trip up on itself. And so you still wind up with turbulence. But I mean, like I said, we have airplanes that are flying way up high, and they're able to get past some pretty turbulent air without any issues, and still find like laminar zones. So yeah, it's
So,
yeah,
so
I
birds
guess
basically,
easier
yeah.
on, yeah, I say more open areas. I guess you could say the air is a little more orderly. But if it's windy, then you should just assume it's going to be all turbulent.
So wind itself is playing a major part in this, and this will also dictate whether or not we're gonna see a lot of birds potentially trying to hunt for any fish above the water, or whether or not the sky is gonna be likely very empty in that time of the day, whenever that is.
So is really cool to watch like an albatross or even a seagull hunting, because they can just use the wind coming off the ocean to keep them afloat. And as long as they are angled just right in the wind, they can hover in place, or they can get a little lower towards the water, or they can lift their way up into the water. And all they have to do is just change direction and either go with the wind or go against the wind. So it's pretty cool to see how they can almost just stay in place without doing much flapping at all, and then just pick up food as they go.
So they're basically tilting most of the time in that case. They're just adjusting their body weights and the wing, the direction of the flow to basically determine how to
Yeah.
quickly. It's a bit like we balance ourselves when we don't always balance ourselves equally on our feet either. By the way, we always balance one foot more than the other, even when we stand still. One foot will, one leg will always have more. Um, Strong sort of, like, how do you explain it? Like it would basically transfer more weight on one of them than the other, rather than equally, you know.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah,
think
that's what
birds have kind of
and,
figured out how to do the same thing with their wings when they are midair doing something.
yes, yeah. How bird brains figure that out has been an area of intense interest as well. Because just like with mammals, birds have brains that fill the entire brain cavity. So it pushes up against the side of the bones, making it easier to CT scan, in our case, the shape of what the brain would look like in the real animal. Whereas in a lot of reptiles, including most dinosaurs, you have brains that are not completely pushing out against the bone. So there's much more, they're covered by a layer of tissue that is filled with blood, and that area and that blood is closer to the bone than the actual brain matter is, so it doesn't make as good of a shape. So if you ever look at images of dinosaur endocasts that show what the brain kind of looks like, they always tend to look like, my old advisor used to call it, is it like the gym sock look? So it just looks like a gym sock you would have. Whereas if you look at a bird or a mammal, you can tend to see where all the different parts of the brain are, because so much of it is pushed against the side of the skull, or against the bones of the skull. So birds have had to have evolved brains that are able to handle the complicated calculations needed to fly and to adjust flight on the fly. They have a really good sense of balance because of that, so their inner ears are really good at adjusting for changes in tilt. And then they have really good
So the vestibular basically
brain
is going to be very good. in
arm
that sense.
coordination from it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so good vestibular system. I feel like we might have gone down a path into the weeds a bit, because one of the questions was what lets birds fly and then what gets lost.
Well, yes, and
So-
I was going to conclude on this since it's a very nice note to kind
Right,
of
so-
say that we've covered the flight and why they can fly. So what about those who cannot fly and how come?
Yes, so the ones that don't fly, they have lost the muscles needed to fly. So they still have those muscles, but they're much reduced. In things like chickens and turkey, again, in the more wild versions of those, the muscles are still there, and they're able to give them the ability to fly short distances, but they don't have the stamina to keep them in flight, and their wings are not good enough to just let them ride air currents for very long. So a chicken and turkey, especially, I'll just stick with wild turkey because it's easier. Like a wild turkey,
Or the ostrich?
really good at or flying into the air. Well, for now we're sticking with the turkey because they can fly,
Okay.
but they can fly just a short distance, right? They can
Right.
go a couple, like maybe a couple hundred meters, and they're up in the air, or they're up in a tree somewhere, and they're in a good
so you
spot.
reckon the
Good
picture
for the
of
burst flying.
So the picture
Kind of a
the
good
ostrich
idea
is
of
not,
you can see how you can go from, okay, I used to fly all the time, but now I'm more interested in looking for stuff on the ground, and I just need to fly to get away every once in a while. And then
Right.
eventually you work your way into not flying at all. So the animals that don't fly, they have, along with reduced muscles there, they also have reduced wings. So their wings are a lot smaller. Yes, in the case of ostriches, the wings are basically just glorified display structures for the males, and maybe a little bit for cooling in both sexes. But then you look at emu or rhea, or not rhea, emu and cassowary, and the wings are just almost like nubs. So the arms have been reduced, and just all of that musculature has been dropped. That big keel that we saw in that color-coded skeleton, so that keel in the sternum is gone, and all those sternal muscles are much reduced. And then the animals get heavier, right? So they're still light because their bones are gonna stay hollow because there's no reason not to. But they might put more fat into the inside of the marrow cavity now, and they can just get larger because now they're not trying to stay airborne, so they can do that. So that's usually what we wind up seeing, is that the animals tend to grow larger, or at least more massive, or a little denser for a given body size, and that the wings have started to atrophy.
So a question here would be, in this case, by the way, pardon that I jumped over you there back a few moments ago, because I thought that I was a bit confused who was gonna talk, and I kept kind of going like, and
Oh yeah, no problem. We don't have like a
Since
There's always going to be that delay.
because we're not scripted either, by the way, just so you guys remember that we are completely, like, we do have a general plan, but we are improvising otherwise. We're not doing it scripted. I don't like scripted content very much. It does have its props, but not my thing really, and you guys hopefully will understand that. So I wanted to ask, just to kind of confirm, in this case, the pheasant and peafowl, those are basically the overglorified, good-looking versions of a chicken who can fly short distances as a burst as well, or are they completely terrestrial at that point?
Yeah, if you bring up that cladogram again,
The big, tall one, you mean?
the big tall one, yep. And if you look under, oh yeah, let's see how that moves. So, yeah, it's right. So you see where the ostrich is,
So that,
and then
yeah.
you go right below that, and then you get into this group called Gallo-Anseri. So that is the birds and the ducks. That is the chickens, turkeys, and ducks, and also peafowl, and also the other one, pheasant. Yeah. So
Right.
it's that group, right? So that is. So if we look at the top of the cladogram, shows the animals that have branched off from aves, or from Neorenathis, the earliest. So they started doing their own thing earlier, right? So that's why we see our Paleonaths up there, right? So we have our tinamou, ostrich, emu, cassowary, rhea, all that up there.
Right.
Then we go into Gallo-Anseri, so that's our galliforms, which is the chickens, turkeys, so on, and then the anseriforms, which are our ducks and all those waterfowl, right? So they're the next ones to branch off. So they're the ones that are popular in dinosaur paleontology specifically because they branch off so early from the rest of the modern birds that they have less of the new traits that we associate with birds. So they have more structures that we might find in earlier ancestors, including in some dinosaurs. So they tend to be good go-tos for that. The other reason why they're a good go-to is because galliforms and anseriforms are both widely domesticated, which means they're really easy to get a hold of. It just happens that it worked out well for us that ostriches and emus are also used in ostrich ranches, emu ranches, so they're used for food, which means that it's not too difficult to get a hold of those either. So we have access to really large birds that happen to be more basally branching, so they have structures that we might find more similar with more ancient critters. In contrast, as you start working our way down, we start to get closer, especially once you get down to like the Neoaves. That's where it starts to turn into all the birds that we really think about. And then I don't see it on there. I guess they just locked it into Neoaves, which is unfortunate. But you run into the Passeriforms, which are the songbirds. And songbirds are the most speciose group of birds. Like everyone knows a songbird because they are everywhere. And they've grown into so many different niches. But they're all the little small birds that run around, your robins, your sparrows, etc.
Is that part of the... let me just see which one it is, because it's a bit difficult to read vertically. Is that
Yeah, they're going to be onto that.
Which color codes are we looking at?
Yeah.
Brown or purple?
They are... Yeah, they're kind of just locked up in... I do not really see them showing up here. Yes, Galatasaray, Paleonath, and pretty sure it's under the Neoaves. Or navies. Let me see if I have another one that might help with that. Yeah, kind of. Well, okay, let me see if I can send this along and we can use this other cladogram too.
This cladogram itself is not bad for my personal, preferences. It's very nicely illustrated, but it's obviously it's got its
yeah, it has its limits.
It has its limits, yeah, as many of them do, unfortunately.
So this other cladogram that I sent that you're gonna put up, at the very top of it, you can see your Passeriform or Passeromorphs or Passeriforms.
So that means
and those are the ones that are gonna go off to be all of our songbirds.
So basically, okay, yes, I see.
But yeah, you can see in this one, it's like the Struthionoforms, so the Paleonaths and all that, and the Galliforms, they're reduced to these tiny things at the very bottom of this group, because it's really blasting out Neoaves. So if you look at the other cladogram, you see Neoaves is just like this short cladogram piece, the yellow bit in yellow, and then it's branching off and showing all the other birds on that one. But now in this new cladogram, it's really focused on Neoaves, so it's basically expanded that section out. You can see just all the many different bird groups under there. And then you have your Passeriforms that are way up there. And if we were to open that up, you'd see just the insane amount of places that Neoaves goes off to, or the Passeriforms go off to, because they're just just super successful group of little birds.
So Passeriforms are basically the ones that are the most sort of...
If you have a bird feeder,
yeah.
Chances are you've seen a bunch of Passeriforms in your bird feeder.
Right.
So what else is there? So we talked about flight, loss of flight, did a little bit about the different species in terms of speciation. Diet and habitat. Habitat is pretty much all over. There's really not a place birds don't go aside from like the bottom of the sea. But there are water birds, birds that live in the water, on the water, and then there are birds that live in marine environments, but there's really only one marine group, and that's the penguins, right? They're the ones that swim underwater and chase fish and stuff and dive pretty deep. Birds live on all 7 of the continents. So we have birds in Antarctica, penguins again. You have birds up in the Arctic, birds on mountains, birds that can fly over mountains. So again, the ability to fly has given birds a very wide range of places they can go to. The fact that they can colonize islands is something that gives them a leg up on mammals, because mammals don't usually colonize islands unless the islands are pretty close to the mainland, just because that high metabolic rate of mammals makes it really hard for them to last long enough at sea and last long enough on an island where food might be really scarce. Whereas if a bird flies to an island and can't find enough food, theoretically they can fly back somewhere else to get more food. It makes birds very important for things like seed dispersal, and as of, I think, last year, we found out for certain, fish dispersal as well.
Oh,
So
really?
if you ever wonder,
Fish
if you ever
dispersal?
wonder, yeah, if you ever wonder why some random lake in like the middle of some landlocked state has fish in it, part of the reason might be because some of those fish eggs were in a bird when the bird landed and just happened to poop into the water, and the fish eggs survived the trip. So it's one of the newer discoveries from, I think it was last year. It was either last year or the year
Hold on.
before.
Sorry. Hold on. I just realized that. Does that mean that the fish eggs potentially can survive a bird digestive tract?
Depending on the fish, yes.
Okay.
I got to find the study on that, but it was a really cool discovery that birds may be major dispersers of fish to various bodies of water.
I'm pretty sure a lot of people listening to this are gonna be pretty interested about this one in particular. I've never heard of this before myself. So is there anything else of that kind when it comes to habitat? Is there... do we know for a fact if there have been any birds living, let's say, in the burrows and underground?
Yeah, there are birds that will live in like little tunnels in the ground. I think Harris hawks might be one of them. I gotta find out. A lot of times birds live in the air, not in the air, sorry, live in trees, because that is where things are safer. But a lot of island birds don't need to do that, so they will live on the ground. Cockapoo are a favorite of mine. Sounds like I just made up a word. Is that the word? No, cockapoo is a dog. What the hell is the thing I'm thinking of? It's a... I'd say we'd strike it, but all this stuff goes live.
Cockerel, no? Maybe.
Hold on, it's an island parrot.
Island parrot? Which one? What island do we mean?
Aha! I was not right. Never mind. It's not cockapoo. Kakapo.
Kakapo.
That's the
Okay,
difference.
I got.
Yeah, cockapos are cool.
Right.
They're island parrots, very large, especially by parrot standards, and they live on the ground. So yeah, they'll live in like under roots in the ground or in like holes in the ground.
It's like a cave bird in a sense, to a degree.
So there's one that might be. I don't usually hear about cave birds. There are birds that will live in caves, but they're what are they called? Troglozines, if I remember right. So they visit caves, but they don't live in caves.
Right.
So like they'll stay there overnight or something, but they like get all their food outside the cave.
Well, the other. What are the other things that we haven't yet? So let's talk about. You said about the habitats.
Okay.
Are we?
There's a
happy with
cockapoo
it?
for everyone who's
Oh
wondering
yes,
what that
yes,
looks
of
like.
course. Let me bring this one up just so that we can obviously take a closer look at one of them. This also looks like a pretty interesting specimen as well. Look at the. Well, I'll put it up on display first so people can see.
They're
what I'm
interesting
talking about.
critters. They definitely have a bit more of the like shaggy look to them. Like they don't keep their feathers as well kept as like a flighted bird would.
It looks like it's got a massive dwarf beard of some kind.
A little bit. They're a little like I can see that, like the dwarfs. Shoot, what else? Oh, while we're talking flight, the other thing we should talk about is, so we talked about One of the things required for flight is you can't be too heavy, so birds tend not to have a lot of fat on them. But the other thing is the importance of flight for birds, not only for taking on different niches, but also escaping predators. So flight is like the number one thing that birds do to get away from a predator. If it's a fox or if it's a cat, even if it's other birds that try to hunt them on the wing, which there are many birds that do it, flight is always like the number one thing that birds use to get away. And because of that, that has led to, or that is likely responsible for why birds are known for extremely fast growth rate, right? So a bird tends to reach adult size in under a year, and they grow at about, I think it's like up to 3 to 5 times faster than a similar sized mammal. And the reason behind that seems largely to be because you want to get to adult size as fast as possible so you can fly. You want to reach a state of a body state where you can get into the air, because that's how you're going to be protected from potential predators.
So the birds that lost their ability to fly, they still grow at the same rate as a sort of inherited trait that they have got from their flight, ancestors, the plesiomorphic trait, if you will. Is that one of those things as well?
Exactly. Yeah. So ostriches and emu will grow to adult size in about a year. So it's, as my old advisor used to say, you can almost see them growing in front of you. So very fast growth rate to reach adult size, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be sexually mature. So even though these animals have reached adult size in under a year, they could still be 3, 4, 5, as far as maybe even 8 years away from being sexually mature. So they're just really big kids, but they're made to big kid size so that they can get away from being eaten. So example I bring up is eagles. They reach somatic maturity in about a year. Sexual maturity takes about 4 to 6 years. And some vultures, it can take up to 8 years. So you'll see like golden eagles or other eagles where they're at adult size, but the adult coloration has not taken place yet. They're still years away from that. Because again, the point is you want to get up to adult size as fast as you can so you can fly away if something's trying to eat you.
That's very interesting, and I also think that if we're talking about the ability to get away from predators, I remember I could not help but noticing, because obviously where I come from, basically, which is in a very broad terms, it's a Eurasian continent, and we do have a bird that is commonly known as a swallow, and we also have bird species of variety of different types of falcons that probably would try to occasionally take their, maybe potentially gambles to go after them. And the sort of crazy sudden maneuvering tactics that swallows show are just insane, of how quickly they can suddenly make these turns. And could this be something like a developed evolutionary path for some of them to escape predators as well?
Oh, you're talking about the way that certain groups of birds will
just mid-air, they'll just move out of like
move as like one whole piece to avoid predators. Yeah, that is a really cool effect that a lot of songbirds will do to avoid getting taken by a predator. It's the airborne equivalent of a bait ball. So if you ever seen like Blue Planet or any of the BBC nature documentaries about sea life, you often see like sardines or smaller fish like that. When they're being attacked, they'll come together to form this large ball, and they will move as one whole unit to avoid getting eaten, which as an individual works, but as a group obviously makes it easier for you to get eaten. And it seems to be similar with the birds, right? And it's the same kind of concept too, because they're flying in this fluid medium, air. They can sense the pressure changes of when one bird's going one way, and so they can all move as a whole unit, which creates this really cool effect when you watch these birds try to avoid getting eaten, where they just turn to this, almost like this super organism that just flies together.
But you know what else is really cool? The reason I brought up swallow as well is that even individually the way they move, they can change direction so suddenly mid-air. It's almost so sharp that you don't even understand how it's physically possible. Like they all of a
Okay.
sudden they would move one direction, then all of a sudden they just like tilt or they drift, and completely change it, or they kind of cut corners suddenly, some crazy stuff. I don't even know how to describe it.
Yeah. So that part is that is related to that wing loading I talked about earlier, where they have the high wing loading, so they have to tend to like flap a lot to stay in the air. That makes them what's called dynamically unstable, or dynamically unstable. So it doesn't take much for them to change direction. But because of that, that makes them super maneuverable. So if you want to be very maneuverable in the air, you want to be dynamically unstable. If you want to be able to just kind of hang out in the air and just go for like hours or even days at a time, you want to be very dynamically stable. So an albatross or a vulture, very dynamically stable. Air can change direction and whatnot, and they're just going to slowly move with it. But that means they can't like cut corners very fast. Whereas a little robin or sparrow can just shoot all over the place, even though they have to spend more effort to stay in the air.
This is really fascinating, and I think this is almost one of those things that I kind of maybe start fantasizing about a little bit. That it would be great if we had like one of those sort of RPG type of games, made where we could have the ability to play as an albatross or as a golden eagle or something like that, and or any other kind of bird, just to kind of try, or actually better yet, prehistoric themed one, and just chuck a bunch of different prehistoric animals in there and get pterosaurs and birds in there as well. I'm surprised why not a lot of people. I mean, some people are already doing it, but not a lot of games I think have really truly been able to figure out how to do it in the best way possible.
Definitely a thing that's in need of work still. Returning to the
But
theme.
let's go back to the yeah.
Oh, one of the things for flight, again, the fact that birds have very high growth rate to reach adult size, even though it's not sexual maturity, so they're not like adults, they're just big kids. That's largely, most likely, because they're trying to avoid being eaten. They're giving their themselves the best chance to survive by being able to fly away. A lot of island birds that become secondarily flightless, they lose that, and they do tend to mature a lot slower, to reach sexual maturity a lot slower than mainland birds, or birds that are still worried about that kind of predation. So we have a kiwi on here. So
Shall I put a display?
Yeah, do the image of the kiwi with the living kiwi.
Yeah.
So there's our kiwi, or was it our New Zealand kiwis, right? So they are flightless birds. They have little dinky arms that don't really do much, and they take a good 4 to 5 years to reach maturity. So like they're not being hunted. They're on these safe islands. There's not a need to go fly away. They can't fly away anyway. So they take a long time to reach maturity because they can.
Well, they also happen to look very cute too. It's almost like you want to pick one up and pet it.
They do look really cute. I've had an opportunity to interact with some that we're going to get a CT scanned. They're a lot larger than you would think, despite the fact that they're small little birds. Kiwi are interesting because they are mostly blind, so they can see, but they don't have like a great sense of sight. So you can see their eyes are a lot smaller. They have that really long bill, and that bill is attached to a pretty well-developed trigeminal sensory system. So they're have a very good sense of touch on their bill, and they use that to root around in the grass in the dark to find food items. So it's a pretty cool, unique thing about kiwis.
Are they bigger than
guess
the
well-
chickens?
I would say they are about the size of a large chicken.
About the size of a large chicken, right?
While we're on the subject of kiwi, if you do the other image,
Yeah.
the skeleton, the thing that is unique to kiwi, aside from the fact that they take a while to get to maturity, they have that really unique way to find food by being very sensitive to touch. The other thing is that they lay the largest eggs compared to body size of any egg-laying animal, or at least among vertebrates. So you can see that image there is showing the egg inside of a kiwi. It's about a third the size of their adult body mass, and it just eats up so much space in the
How
abdomen of that.
how does this affect their internal organs readjusting inside, or how does that even work?
Yeah, that's a good question because you can see how tight that is in there.
It's very tight.
Yeah, it
If
must
somebody,
compress
what? If
things.
somebody has told me about this without producing this type of evidence, I would have just said no freaking way.
It is ridiculous. Obviously, they only lay one egg at a time. And I'm betting that the female probably doesn't do a lot of eating at this time because once it's reached that size, I mean, the shelling part of the egg happens at the very end. So the egg would be a little bit more squishy inside the abdomen at this point. But this is probably just at the point of being laid. And it was probably very uncomfortable. It's probably very uncomfortable for the female at that point.
I wanted to ask you, see, so does that mean that basically only one egg at that point gets laid, right? And also, are we safely able to transition into their reproduction, or shall we?
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay, so let's,
I will,
because
I guess,
think this would be a very nice sort of way to start getting into their reproduction tactics and other things, because there's a lot of stuff involved into this as well.
yes. Yeah, so birds all lay eggs, so there are no live bearing species. Eggs vary from from one, like with this kiwi, to, maybe 5 or 6 at a time. And both parents will watch the eggs. Well, it depends on the species. I shouldn't say that. Eggs are there's parental care in birds largely across the board. They will sit on their eggs to warm them for most species. There are instances there's one very notable exception to this. That is the Megapode birds. So they're like from New Guinea. They are in the same group as our chickens and turkeys, so the galliforms, right? So they're near that group, I should say. And they lay eggs in mounds of rotting vegetation, just like an alligator. And so the parents will guard, or the female will guard the eggs while they're in that vegetation, and then afterwards, once the kids hatch, they are what's called super precocial. But basically, they hatch and they're out, so they walk off. There's no parental care. The other exception to that comes from cuckoo birds, not cuckoo birds. Yes, cuckoo birds.
Cuckoo birds. Mm-hmm.
Yes, they do something called nest parasitism. So they will so the female, when she's ready to lay an egg, will find another bird's nest, and when that bird is out to lunch, she will lay her egg in that nest and maybe even push out some of the other eggs to make room for it. Then that egg will hatch, and because the mother bird, I don't know, doesn't think twice about it, she assumes that's her baby, and she will take care of that baby as if it was one of her own, along with all the other babies. Oftentimes, cuckoo bird babies will lay their egg, or will be born before the other eggs, and so they will either push out the hatchling will either push out the other eggs, or will push out the other hatchlings and just outcompete them for food. So those are our exceptions, like the ones that don't do parental care and do sort of their own weird thing with the parasitism. But most other birds, they do take care of their eggs, so they'll lay eggs in a nest that they build for themselves. So the nest is usually up in a tree. There are some ground nesting birds. Again, if you're an island bird in an area where there's not a lot of predation, they tend to be ground nesters. So that tells us that tree nesting is probably more of a response to predation.
Or if you can fight off whatever potential adversary.
Or if you can fight off whatever potential.
I'm looking at you, Mute Swan.
Yes, yeah, a lot of the waterfowl, they tend to still be nesting on the ground, and they're tough little boogers.
Oh yeah, we will talk about them a little bit in a few, because they do display a very interesting thing that I would like you to delve deep into. But before we get into that as well, I wanted to obviously go into uh, how are we, obviously before the laying of the egg starts, we know for a fact, obviously we're not all kids here, but that mating has to occur, right? But in order for the
Yeah,
mating to
we should probably
occur,
go back on that.
I was gonna say
Yeah,
before the
so
mating occurs, then something else has to happen, and we do know that a lot of birds engage into a lot of sophisticated behavior to generate that sort of, initiate that sort of process. So, what can you tell us about
yeah,
that?
so a lot of birds do courting to attract females, and that courting varies from species to species. Some species will make elaborate nest-like structures to really like impress females. Others many times will call to females, so they'll do a special song. A lot of what we hear with our songbirds, of course, is that song. It's singing to attract mates or to scare away rivals that they're protecting their area. Some, like birds of paradise, they will do elaborate visual displays using their feathers to and dances to get the female's attention. Of course, the most sort of iconic example of this is, or not for birds of paradise, but most iconic example of the males getting the attention of the females is probably peacocks, right? So male peacocks with their very iridescent plumage and those very long tail feathers will use those tail feathers to attract the female, and will even do a little dance where
Regarding
they
a
shake
peacock,
tail feathers.
a quick insert, if you don't mind, is that obviously the female peafowl, peahen, basically, I think if that's correct, uh, does not realize that under this fluffy peacock tail is just a common chicken butt. It's a joke that we have among the Russian-speaking, basically, communities and cultures. It has a lot to do with people showing off, and this is a very frequent comparison, so I just thought I'd quickly interject that, but sorry if I distracted you there.
No, no worries. All good.
I have this
Trying
bird
to
on
find
display here while we're
bird
talking
character.
about this. It's this kind of bird with like a very nice sort of crest-ish thingamajiggy with a blue sort of face, and it's like a brownish color that you sent me. I don't know what it's called, but I decided to put that on display. Is that something that you were referring to?
Bluish face.
And like it's basically got a black top with some white highlights and the beige yellow underbelly.
Oh, I know which one you're showing. Tell you what, let's do this one. Oop, hold on a minute. Since we're talking about, oh, come on, it's gotta be so tiny. Hold on a minute. Find something that's not so tiny. Yeah, so the image that you have up right there, and we can talk about it. That's actually a Hoatzin,
Watson, okay.
and they are interesting because are they've garnered a lot of attention because their young have little claws on their hands, and they use those claws to climb. They also have been very integral to paleo art, because if you've ever seen, and we've all seen it, like pretty much every image of Archaeopteryx has the coloration of a Hoatzin. Like that's just
Yeah,
that's the coloring that people decided that's what Archaeopteryx should look like, because apparently Watsons look like Archaeopteryx.
well, yeah, somehow they figured that one out. Go figure, I don't know. I mean, I'm almost tempted to ask, but if I start that, that's gonna start a rant.
Yeah, it's basically just whatever.
So what was your idea? Which one shall we look at in order to better
I'm going
illustrate?
to, yeah, I'll send you the image real quick. It's, I was gonna send you a picture of a bird of paradise so people have something to look at.
Sure. And while you're looking for it, so I can basically just keep the whole process going, are pheasants somewhat similar in the way they attract their mates to the peacocks? Rather than, obviously, they don't have these as fluffy tails, obviously, but the looks and the sexual dimorphism between males and females are present quite distinctly, aren't they?
They are. I'm not entirely sure with how pheasants do it, but I know that their relatives, turkeys, the males do something similar where they have a large tail fan and they have very colorful heads and necks. And then they have a structure called a snood, which is this large, fleshy, erectile tissue that they can engorge with blood and that will just kind of droop down. And I don't know why, but females find that very attractive. So they will do that to
whatever
get the
floats your
females
boat.
Yes, indeed. But here's, I just threw in a picture of a bird of paradise because they're some of the showiest birds that you'll see, and they do elaborate dances, create pieces of like art for females to judge them,
This is really
and they also
interesting.
do great songs.
It looks like
So,
he is
and
almost
really
trying
you
to
see
go
it.
for a kiss.
It does, yeah. And then like those like whippy tendrils are just feathers.
Yeah.
So lots of crazy featheration, or
Yet
sort of
notice
for
that the borders, they're so
plumage on
strongly
birds.
outlined, the borders of the colors.
Yes. Of course, there's a great BBC documentary that shows some of the many dances that you can see with birds of paradise, including that fun bird of paradise that basically just his whole head disappears underneath his feathers when he like pops them out.
A question
recommend
about
it
them,
for
by
you.
the way, speaking of, well, two things. First, where are they found? And also, how many species of them are together alive, if there's more than one?
Oh yeah, there are. It's a whole very diverse group of animals. So again, they're passeriforms because of course they are. Yeah, there's about 44-ish species, and multiple genera. So very diverse group of critters. And they are found, yeah, in that sort of Southeast Asia area. So you can find them in Australia, New Guinea, a lot of islands, because birds of paradise usually found on islands.
Wow.
So yeah, you find them down around there. Like I said, highly diverse group. Very good at getting the attention of females using very showy feathers and dances and songs.
So the length our boy is gonna go to just so that he can basically stick it to you know where.
Well, since we're on that subject, a thing that some of your readers or some of the people in the channel probably are aware of, and if you're not, then you're about to be. Most birds, especially once you get into the neonaths, so away from paleonaths, most birds the males don't have a penis. So their intromittent organ doesn't exist.
So the tool is not there, basically.
The tool is not there. They still have internal reproduction, but it's done via a behavior that has been affectionately called the cloacal kiss, where the male will run up or will fly up to the female and press his cloaca against hers and transfer sperm that way. The reasoning behind why so many birds lack a penis is not really known. Again, the old saw of it's a weight-saving feature probably ain't that true because it can't be that heavy. But it is interesting to note that your paleonaths, so your ostrich, emu, rhea, things like that, they all have a penis. And then perhaps most famously, ducks also have a penis, and it is a particularly large and corkscrew-shaped penis.
So it's a basal trait. Penis presence is a basal trait for the males.
Yes, it is most likely a basal trait. So if you're wondering if dinosaurs had a penis, then
It's
the
more
males
likely
did.
they probably do.
Pretty likely they did. Crocodilians do as well. So you can bracket the whole thing together, a penis of some kind, though they are differently formed, which is interesting. But that might be, who knows? Certainly with the duck penis, that seems to be its own separate thing because that actually grows during the mating season and then goes away after the mating season. So they do not always have a corkscrew penis, only when it counts.
Yeah, so yeah, okay. I'm not gonna go where I was gonna go in terms of where my thoughts are taking me, so let's just skip that because I have a lot of things to say, but it's so irrelevant and it's dirty, so I'm not gonna do that. Right. Ducks, by the way, are also another group that I wanted to touch up on because I noticed, and the reason I say that is because I observe a lot of them here in England, since whenever I go out for a walk near the water, we have a lot of what is known as the Mallard Duck, which are sure you know them very well as well. And
Yes.
they seem to have a common thing about their sexual dimorphism that is very obvious, is the coloration. So what can you tell us about the difference in coloration in terms of the sexual dimorphism in birds and
Yeah, males tend to be the more colorful species, more colorful gender, or the more colorful sex. So they're the ones that will be attracting the females, putting on a show for the females. Right, so male peacocks versus female peahens, they very different. Birds of paradise, usually the same deal, where the male is the more showy, the female is much more drab in color. So she's the choosy one, so he has to perform for her. There are a couple of bird species where the dimorphism is reversed. A couple, especially raptors, so raptorial species, the female tends to be larger than the male. And others, their size may be the same, or there might be a slight sexual size dimorphism in favor of males. But most of the dimorphism seems to be in coloration, so the feathers will be a different shape or a different color in the males compared to the females. Again, a good sign that one, that birds are very visually oriented and that they have a good sense of color.
how would their sense of color compare to, say, the previous Archosaur group that we examined in the last video, which was the Crocodilians?
Yes, so we talked a little bit about that. That crocodilians should be their range of color reception is reduced compared to birds and lizards, but still is on par with what you'd see with humans. With birds, they have tetrachromatic vision, so they have 4 different photoreceptors. One of those photoreceptors lets them see into the near UV range. So they're getting really high energy ultraviolet light, and they're able to see that, which means that the coloration you see on like a mallard is the coloration we see, but not the coloration a female duck would see, or a female mallard would see. Right, so she would see all those colors and then some ultraviolet patterning as well that we can't really see. Like we have cameras that can recognize ultraviolet light, and we can see the patterns that the ultraviolet light makes, but we can't imagine really what the color is aside from some kind of violetish extra color.
So is this somehow related to how the male mallards and some other birds as well? I noticed this on the pigeons, on their like collars, or on just general on their heads. They have a very sort of pearly, reflective type of coloration on their brighter parts, and could this be somewhere where this ultraviolet type of perception would come into play, like creating some kind of very glowy look, like a glowy halo kind of effect, perhaps for the males? So it just shows up as like, here I am.
It could be there. It could also be on the parts that are not iridescent. It's hard to say. You need to look at the structures. Actually, I wonder if anyone's done that. Let me see.
And also, while you are looking for this, can we briefly address the parental care in them? And just not only just parental care, but starting from the fact that how the pair bonding works and whether or not we see a lot of lifetime pair bonding, temporary pair bonding, and obviously the parental care by forming a group, flock, family, etc.
Yeah. So we mentioned that the males court the females either through elaborate song or dance or something with imaging, or they'll make a amazing piece of art out of like detritus. And then there's the mating, which tends to go pretty fast. Then some species, males will mate with multiple females and beholden to none. So then the females will just raise the young. in paleonaths, especially with ostrich emu, the males are the ones that will watch the eggs. So the females will lay the eggs and the male will watch it. In the case of ostriches, many females will lay eggs in the same spot, and then one male ostrich will watch over all of those eggs and then all of those babies. So that part is interesting. There's that variation, right? And then, of course, with the cuckoo birds, where there's no female, there's no parental care. They just toss it off they pawn it off on some other poor unsuspecting bird.
Or the mute swan that basically forms a pair for life, if I'm correct?
Yes. There is pair bonding that can last for the entirety of the lives of the birds. Lovebirds are obviously the classic examples because they mate for life. The fun one for me that I like is I gotta remember the name. I can't remember the specific name. It's penguins. It's a species of penguin. It might be multiple species probably. That they mate for life, but they don't stay together that entire time. So when they mate, when they'll mate, and then the female will lay the egg, and then the male will go off hunting for food, and then come back and find his mate, and they'll get together again, and then he'll share his food with her or with the baby, and then she'll go off and get food, and they'll just switch off during the entire egg laying season, and they'll take care of their eggs that way. Interestingly, yeah, for especially with penguins, because many of them live in Antarctica, or on Antarctica. They lay their eggs, but they can't lay their eggs on the ice because the ice will just sap all that heat away from the developing embryo.
Exactly,
so they have to hold the eggs between their feet that entire time, and even as the two parents switch, they have to pass the egg over without touching the ice. So that's pretty cool. And then
that is a very interesting thing I never knew.
Yeah, they'll hang together really close during bad storms in Antarctica or really cold nights, so they can all stay warm as a group. It's pretty impressive that penguins or any species of bird is able to make a living that far down south in a particularly inhospitable area.
I found it also another thing that's interesting. So aside from pairs, we also noticed that some bird species form harems, especially. Obviously, we talk about males, how they just have an absolutely insane amount of females following them around, and their groups. Like the farm geese, for example, is a very good example that I can think of. The rooster and the chickens as well is another good one. And notably, from personal experience, from interacting with them, because I have been chased by both actually as a kid, out of my own stupidity, obviously. And they are incredibly and fiercely protective of their harems. And it makes no difference whether you're a human or anything else, they'll just have a go at you. They'll be the first line of defense, basically.
Oh yeah, I believe that. Yeah, they are. They're despite the potential to get really messed up. A lot of birds will be fiercely protective over their young. Either attacking a predator that's coming close to the nest, or attacking one that's going after their babies. And then if you're talking about swans, actually doing physical damage to anything that gets close to their babies.
I've seen that happen, by the way, several times, since I've observed and interacted with swans many times, since obviously there's a lot of them here in England. It's almost like a symbol whenever anything related to the Thames River, famously. It's like the mute swan is like a symbol of that place and as a whole. So I'm pretty sure Switzerland would definitely boast a similar kind of symbolic, since there's a lot of them over there too. And I wanted to say that they are basically the kind of family group that I've noticed and observed personally, that when their cygnets are capable of moving on the water with them, that the mother tends to stay very close with them, and the father is the one who basically goes forward and makes sure that everybody else gets out of the way. And the father tends to also have this thing that he would buff up his shoulder, like lift the wings up a little bit, like he's flexing his shoulders to make himself look more menacing. And I've noticed that this is the first telltale sign that if you get in his way, then the next thing is gonna come in. He's gonna charge probably.
Nice.
So it's
I
very,
sent an
very,
image in the
yeah.
Discord of
Oh yeah, I'm downloading it as we speak.
Yeah, so they're doing that. Yeah, I could see that. Just making it clear to any potential predators that they're
not welcome, basically. That's what he's trying to say. And it's not just predators, it's other animals as well. Have you seen what they're doing to Canada geese or mallard ducks as well? Good grief. They absolutely destroy them.
Oh, jeez, really?
They would just absolutely... They actually seen one pick up a mallard duck that was trying to steal its food out of its beak, because I remember before I obviously knew better, I fed them bread, which I realized I shouldn't be doing, so then I later started feeding them seeds, which made things a lot better and simpler as well in that sense. But when I fed them bread, this male swan picked up the piece of bread, that slice, and the mallard duck tried to take it off his beak while he was still holding it. But what happened was that the swan quickly spat out the bread, quickly then grabbed that mallard duck by its neck, wiggled it around a little bit, and then tossed it aside. And I think the duck was very lucky that it ended up surviving and not having its neck broken right there and then.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's the kind of things they do. Or a Canada goose that passes by, and you know how Canada geese, they are honky, they like to honk a lot. Maybe swans just get a little bit annoyed by that, and they just kind of just try to have a go with them. And of course, whenever they start grabbing their necks, these geese, they start yelling like crazy.
Yeah, and that is the other thing we can think about with birds, is they're very vocal.
Yes,
So
vocalization of birds as well. That would be a nice one to touch on.
They have a wide sense of. We talked about about the range of hearing, but that especially in the as we get closer to the songbirds, we get into a lot more vocalization, both for territorial defense to attract mates. It's interesting that I guess before we jump into vocalization, just the other thing on reproduction is a thing that we notice with a lot of birds is because they incubate their eggs by sitting on them, they're transferring their heat onto their young, but because feathers are so good at insulation, there's not a lot of transfer that can take place. So a lot of birds have evolved a bare structure of skin. A lot of bird females and some males that have a bare structure of skin that they use to warm the eggs. So that's called a brood patch. So I sent an image in that too, so people can see. It's just this one area of bare skin, and they'll just press that up against their eggs, and so the heat can transfer directly from the inside of their body to the developing eggs, so they can keep them nice and warm. And then the rest of the feathers just keep that heat from escaping.
What is the bird species that you sent me the image of? Who is this one?
I think that might be another osprey.
Another osprey, okay. And do they have to actually expose this brood patch, or would you actually be able to see it if you flip them upside down like that, or do you have to actually expose it?
To be fair, because credit where credit is due, it is a kestrel, female kestrel,
right,
by Jared B. Clark from Birding Saskatchewan's blog. So he's the guy who took the picture, but that's a female kestrel, and you can just see the brood patch on her.
Right.
So again, there to transfer heat. You can also see these on emu. So it's pretty much, it's definitely a Neorenathis thing. It might go further back in time, but it is a way that if you are going to sit on your eggs, that you have a way to transfer that heat to them.
The reason I ask is because the other image of the osprey that you sent me did not seem to show that sort of brood patch, and I wanted to know how come. What is the main catch here?
Well, we're looking at the bottom of this. So, one, different bird species.
Okay.
But two, is that we are looking at the bottom, the very ventral side of this bird, and you can see that the feathers have also been pushed away to expose it.
Right. So obviously, as they fly, it would realign itself, and then if it needs to sit, it just tilts it to the point where it can basically birds are just so great at this that they'll just figure everything out at this point.
The other thing is brood patches are seasonal.
Oh yeah.
So only when the eggs have been laid, or before the eggs have been laid, will a brood patch develop. So basically, like a patch of alopecia, where just they lose all their feathers in that spot, and then it'll grow back after the eggs have hatched. So that's the other reason why I see it. Another thing that is seasonal in birds, in female birds only, obviously, is this concept of medullary bone. So it is extra calcium that is stored inside the hollow bones of female birds that is then used to provide the calcium for eggshells when they're laying their eggs. So that is a thing that develops as the birds are developing their eggs and then is lost right after hatching because all that extra calcium has gone into making the shells. That has been found in dinosaurs and has been used as a means to provide direct evidence for the sex of a dinosaur.
So we only know who the female is if we find those ones for a fact, but we don't if we can positively confirm it. But of course,
yes, if we can positively confirm it, then we can say that is a female.
But if there is
the catch is if it's an immature specimen, or if it wasn't laying eggs at the time, or if it's a male, then it's not going to have medullary bone. You're not going to be able to tell.
Yeah, that's what I was going to refer to. That basically just because on the other side of things that we can only know that was the female only because we happened to catch that specimen and find that specimen when it was during that specific stage.
Right. It's kind of like if we found a dinosaur that had eggs in it, we could say, well, that was a female.
Mm-hmm.
So both are rare occurrences, but they do occasionally happen.
So anything else about the reproduction?
Yeah, like I said, oftentimes it's both parents taking care of the baby. Oftentimes the parents are feeding the children. So it depends on the species, but a lot of birds give birth to very, it's called altricial babies. So babies that require a lot of parental care, and they get fed by the parents. These are the babies that tend to grow the fastest. The precocial babies, so like chicken babies, they don't usually get fed by the parents, but they get led to food by the parents and get protected while they're eating, so they can focus just on eating. So there is parental feeding in birds that can be done either by bringing some food to them, like worms or insects, or eating food ahead of time and storing it in a special section of their throat called the crop, which is basically like a little storage pack, and then coming back and regurgitating that food into the developing babies, which is not so pretty. And then lastly, there is a species or a few species of pigeons that will actually produce a milky-like substance from their crop and let their babies eat that. So it's called crop milk, obviously, because coming from there.
Right.
So it's almost the equivalent of lactation in a bird. So a heavy emphasis on parental feeding in at least Neorenathian birds. Whether or not that extended all the way back outside of aves or into dinosaurs, we don't know. But it is interesting to see this heavy focus on parental care and parental feeding in birds.
I wanted to ask about the sexual dimorphism once more, and there is a specific topic in it. So I'm sorry if I interrupted, so feel free to finish that one up, and then we can move to that part as well.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I wanted to ask about the reverse sexual dimorphism in terms of obviously exception or the rule. Then obviously next part is how much further back do we know for a certain in terms of when it first evolved, not only just in birds but in Archosauria in general, perhaps, if possible to answer, and in birds too. And whether or not actually birds may be the only known archosaurs, as in like the avian ones, like whether or not basically the aves as a whole group would be the only group of archosaurs that we positively know have actually exhibited the reverse dimorphism, where obviously we see that the females are either larger or are more prominent, or in other ways stand out more than the males, where the males, for the lack of a better term, are more inferior in comparison. So, did I throw out too many, or do you want me to split them up a little bit?
I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, we mentioned earlier that there is reverse sexual size dimorphism in the raptorial birds, so your hawks, eagles, that kind of stuff. Why it is, don't know. Again, the assumption is always that if the female's larger, it's because she can hold more eggs. Does it actually translate well, especially in birds? Especially because a lot of birds will lay eggs multiple times in a year. So how often do you need to hold a bunch of eggs versus just make more eggs over a reduced period of time? So it's hard to say why this reverse sexual size dimorphism happens. It would not be a basal trait for birds, or because it's only seen in some Neorenathian birds, and it's pretty far into the tree when that happens. So I wouldn't call it like a synapomorphy or anything for birds, or something that we could accurately trace back into the fossil record. It seems pretty variable, kind of like in that first video where we talked about how sexual size dimorphism follows in different squamates, how it's just, or in turtles. I was like, if there's a trend, it's a weak trend, so it seems pretty variable. It doesn't seem to take a lot for you to have sexual size dimorphism in one way, in one area or the other. So not really sure why.
Do we know any exceptions in terms of the Raptorian birds of prey where it's either the other way around or where they are indistinguishable in size? If you don't remember, that's okay too.
I am not sure.
All right.
We'll add that to the comments if someone wants to just toss in some.
Feel free. Yeah.
Examples where the male like a male hawk or something is larger.
Or something else of anything of that sort. Okay, and in this case, does this potentially put a bit of a dent or a very big and just generally a very extreme question mark on some of the commonly proposed theories in regards to how some female dinosaurs species were larger than their male counterparts as well?
Yeah, I just don't think we know. Like, I mean, for most dinosaur species, we only know them from one or two skeletons, so the sample size is just too small to say one way or the other. Maybe for the larger, like Coelophysis deathbeds or the various centrosaur fossil beds, we can get a better idea of how size dimorphism splits across dinosaurs. But if I remember right, the studies that have looked at that have not really found strong support for size dimorphism at all. So yeah, I'd say there's a bit of a dent there. I would not rely on a gracile and robust morph right now because.
Well, there's been already some studies. I believe even Thomas Carr in his monograph regarding the Tyrannosaurus specifically has addressed that there is a very big sort of elephant in the room regarding this whole robust versus gracile morph when it comes to the Tyrannosaurus rex in particular, which is a very common one to bring up for some reason. Well, not for some reason, we know why, but let's just say that in case you are watching this and you are new to the channel and you have been under the impression that female T-Rexes are bigger than the males because you watched either Walking with Dinosaurs or When Dinosaurs Roamed America, yeah, that's for all intents and purposes, according to the present knowledge, this is likely false.
Yes.
And the reason being, we don't know one way or the other, but it could basically either be a complete opposite, the males could be bigger, like in the crocs, or it could be that there was no specific pattern, so it means that it would be individually variation, which means that they would basically be same, because obviously they could be quite diverse in terms of where do they stop growing, at which size range, they cap out, and individuals, like say an individual female, could be bigger than many other individual males, while there may be an individual male that is bigger than many other individual females, and it kind of goes on and on like that. So I think that's quite a big possibility too, when it comes to dinosaurs especially, and theropods maybe too.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And
So slight tangent, of course, but I thought it was worth bringing that up and addressing it in case somebody was still believing in that myth. But anything else in regards to obviously their reproduction and sexual dimorphism that is worth bringing up, or shall we move on to maybe the dietary aspects?
Yeah, I think we covered a lot with reproduction. We can go ahead and move to diet.
I would say go to diet, and then after diet we could go into the vocalization as well.
Yeah, so for diet, basically birds eat pretty much everything. So most birds eat insects. So most birds are insectivorous. Then there's groups that are granivores, so they eat seeds, right? So there's a lot of your songbirds are going to be like that's what they're eating at the bird feeder. And then you have your raptorial birds that are big into eating meat, so they're the big hunters. They'll also eat fish and carrion, right? So vultures will go after carrion. Then we have our nectarivores, right? So the what do you call the apodiforms, or the footless birds, which are your hummingbirds, which they have feet, but their feet are very tiny. But they live off of nectar, right? So they're going to eat nectar from flowers and just basically just live on sugar highs all the time. Yeah, that, and then yeah, like ducks, which will eat algae. So you see them snapping up algae, but they'll also eat water bugs that they find. And then geese will graze on grass, but they'll also eat like random insects they find. So a fairly omnivorous group. Mostly they are most birds are insectivores, but there is a fair amount that will go into eating plant food as well. And they're the ones that usually have the well-developed gizzard that we talked about last time that helps them pulverize up that plant matter and let them get the nutrients from that.
So like a special adaptation as well to further grind and pulverize their food in order
right, because birds can't chew, so they have to find something to chew for them. So that's what they're doing with that. Whether or not that also extends beyond birds, turns out is a little bit harder to say. Like we said, there's a partitioned space in the stomach of crocodilians that they do use to house rocks, but they don't seem to do a lot of grinding, which makes sense because you don't have to do a lot of grinding for meat. But that means that like evidence for a gizzard in dinosaurs has been harder to come by, because whether or not that is all that needed. Hadrosaurs, would they need a gizzard? Well, they have really good tooth battery, which suggests they're doing most of their processing orally. Same thing with ceratopsians, so maybe it wasn't that important. Evidence for gastroliths, and so a gizzard in sauropods wound up being less definitive. So,
and
might be more of a bird thing.
Ah, sure.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to ask about, obviously, not necessarily ask, but do we have any modern birds that show something that you could almost refer to pseudo-teeth, which we do see in the extinct animals like Pelagornis, I believe, and its relatives, which we will definitely touch when we get into the extinct group in another volume of this segment, but is there anything of sort that we see and observe in the modern day birds, or have those types gone extinct altogether for now?
Yeah, there are birds, especially the water birds, that do have what look like teeth, but are just, they're just keratinous, sharpened keratinous pieces that are just coming off the beak. But they basically are doing the same job as teeth. I'm trying to get a good image to just show it off. Here we go.
And of course,
and I'll put that to there, so you can see that.
Let's
So yeah,
see.
it's interesting because there's a lot of hypotheses for why beaks would evolve at all, and it does seem that beaks are incompatible with teeth because they take up the same space. But both in birds and in some turtles, you get, or in some birds and in some turtles, you do see this sort of re-evolution of tooth-like structures. So,
And in the
teeth are
image
still
that you
help
have
with a bug
provided,
beak.
what is the bird species? Is this some kind of goose or what
It
is
is a goose.
It is a
Yes.
goose, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm surprised I didn't
Look at that.
recognize
Look at
these
that.
things.
It's
These
got
things
such
have
happy-
used to terrify me as a kid. I'm surprised I never recognized this evil face.
Yeah, and it's pretty crazy. So it does still come in handy for some birds to have tooth-like structures, possibly because it acts still as a sieve, and also it provides the shearing that maybe those particular shaped beaks are not particularly good at. But it is interesting to see this kind of re-evolution of tooth-like structures.
And also, there seems to be some kind of barbs on its tongue as well.
Yes, yeah, that's probably because they're using it more as like a sieve to help separate things from the water. So if they're getting like water bugs, so they can then grab the insect in their mouth with a bunch of water and then just push their tongue up against the roof of their mouth and just push all that extra water out, so they just swallow their water bug. So that part makes sense.
Oh yes, absolutely.
So there's that. Yeah, so like I said, diet, they will eat all kinds of stuff. There are even birds that are able to eat harder food, including like turtles, and they'll use the fact that they can fly to toss those animals from the sky and crack open their shells. So they don't have to have particularly strong jaws. Yeah, you don't have to have particularly strong jaws if you're a bird, as long as you can get high enough in the air to toss something.
Yeah, just imagine being a turtle in that sort of oh my god, that would have been absolutely disgusting way to die.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what else is there to say? So that's largely for diet and habitat.
Digestion.
Say again?
Digestion. How quickly
Yeah.
do they digest their food, and sort of just the general things that you can point out if there is anything of particular interest, maybe in contrast to crocodilians, other members of Archosaurus, of the extant Archosaurus.
It's similar in that they digest their food pretty fast, again, because retention time means extra weight. So if you're a flighted animal, it helps to eat energetically, like easily digested food, or food that packs a good amount of energy fast, unless you can afford the space to let it ferment, which birds don't usually have the space for. So they'll do use with their gizzard, crunching up the food that way, so it gets digested faster. The other one is with owls, as I mentioned last time, if they the undigested parts of the food they eat, so the bits of bone and the fur, will get combined into a nasty little hairball that they call owl pellets that the birds will then upchuck later on. Birds swallow stones, especially the ones that have the gizzard specifically will swallow stones, and that's what they're using in their gizzard to help grind up the food. And then once those gastroliths have been worn too clean, they will throw up those stones and find new stones.
So in some ways they are actually very similar to the crocodilians in that sense. They will utilize some similar methods in some cases.
So there are traits that we're seeing that span both groups, and even outside of those groups, which we can hypothesize may have been present then in a lot of extinct critters. Carrion eating with vultures. So vultures are the only obligate scavenger that we can think of, but at least that I can think of, that we see in the world today. And the hypothesis is that, well, one, not all vultures are obligate. Some of them will hunt, but the ones that do just live off carrion are able to do so because it's very cheap to just ride a thermal all day long. And that gives you a huge range to look over without spending a lot of energy. And they have a really good sense of smell, so if they do smell something that's dead or dying, they're able to locate it pretty quickly.
So this means, and there also happens to be a coincidence that these kind of exclusive scavenger vultures, they have pretty big wingspans. So that means they don't expend a lot of energy on flying around very much, do they?
Exactly. Yeah, they're using that high wing loading to just give them a free ride, so they can just sit there and just look for food or just relax and fly around all day, so they don't have to use up a lot of energy. So if you're going to live off of dead things, that's the way to do it. Find a way to cover a large distance very cheaply.
And find obviously the animal that is either that's basically just about to die, so that you can quickly dig in before something else that is potentially a threat to yourself is gonna come up here and chase you away, or worse.
And then obviously they have to have a very strong, immune system, because they're going to be eating some pretty nasty food.
Oh yeah, I bet that they're resistant and immune to pretty much most things that could potentially be out there to get them. Like anything else, basically, that would normally get infected and potentially die from it, these guys probably don't care. And this is also another interesting thing that I'm tempted to bring up, well, even though we're not going to get into details, because we will have a chance to do this, is about how some pterosaur groups of similar type of wingspans, if you will, ratio to their bodies would have potentially could have been, if not obligate, but at the very least very like full-time, part-time-ish scavengers, like those how do you pronounce their names properly? The family name that is basically including Archaeopteryx, Quetzalcoatlus, and etc.
Yes, so they may have been able to be carrion feeders as well, right? Because they had such high wing loading as well, because they were just so huge that they could spend a lot of time on the wing and just look for food. Whether or not they did, it's difficult to tell, because how do you test that in long extinct animals? But it is an option.
Yeah. What is the name? How do you pronounce their family tree? Like this family tree? How do you pronounce it?
Oh, for pterosaurs, that's the Asdarchidae.
Asdarchidae, right? Okay, there we go.
Or Asdarchidae, yeah, Asdarchids. So they're the ones that give rise to the really, really big pterosaurs. That some of them may have been secondarily flightless, though that's up in the air.
Yeah, very much up in the air. We will definitely cover them, so we won't get into this right now. But there will definitely be a segment of pterosaurs, and possibly even multiple parts, just because there are some groups that probably would deserve to have their own videos. So I mean, I would definitely see this splitting, pterosaur splitting maybe into maybe 2 parts at most, I would say, based on how we do it, about 2.5 hours for each, I would probably say. So we could even maybe do a whole thing in 2.5 hours, but we'll see. So yeah, that's something potentially to look forward to, those who are watching. And
so go ahead and hop into, or pushing time again as usual, because there's just so much to talk about.
I'd say we're close towards the 2.5 hours, but let's whatever you have to say, let's just bring this up. So obviously
so here's an image of I just sent an image showing the structure you see down there called the syrinx. So that is a thing unique to birds, maybe unique to Neorenathines, maybe, but I think it might be an Aves thing. It's definitely found, at least just in birds so far. It is the voice box for birds. Right. So in humans and in mammals and in crocodilians, we use a larynx. So that's that big Adam's apple you can feel in your throat.
Yep.
So that not only covers the airway when we're swallowing and keeps food from getting into our airways, but also has our vocal cords, and that's what lets us make all the lovely sounds you've heard today. In birds, they do have a larynx, but it doesn't have a vocal cord. It doesn't have any vocal cords in it, so it's just there as just there to keep food from getting down the throat. Instead, birds evolved vocal cords down at the base of their trachea, so right where just before it bifurcates to go into the lungs, and that's a structure called the syrinx. And it's not even vocal folds. There's their own specific structures down there, but it lets them manipulate sound waves way down deep by their lungs. But that's how birds are able to make all the many different sounds that they're able to make today. And obviously we know the syrinx works just as well as a voice box, as our voice box, because there are birds today, corvids and parrots, that are able to talk just like people.
Oh yes. Talking was
So,
another big point I wanted to bring up, but I'm glad you did it already.
so all the manipulation that we do to talk is done with a mix of messing around with our vocal folds and moving our mouth and tongue in just the right way. With birds, it's pretty much all done at the syrinx. So their mouth can open and the sounds are going to come out as if they were moving their mouths the way we do, which is crazy. So lots of impressive manipulation of sound that goes on down there. Exactly why birds evolved a syrinx instead of just putting vocal folds in a larynx, we don't know. It may have something to do with the lower sound waves that birds tend to run in. So they tend to run in like the lower frequencies, just like other archosaurs do. But it's interesting because you don't see a syrinx in paleonaths, so you don't see them in ostriches or emu, and those animals make a loud booming sound or a low booming sound. So it's more like a growly, rumbly sound, almost like thunder.
Right.
It's not until you start getting more into these songbird territory that we start to get all the many, many different sounds that you hear and we associate with birds. And that's all thanks to that syrinx.
So, is this something that can be traced in any way? Well, obviously this is something that doesn't leave fossil evidence behind now, does it? Or it does?
Okay, I gotta hold on, fix up my mistake there. Yeah, sorry. It is, you do see a syrinx in paleonaths. It's just it doesn't seem to do much. So yes, all birds have a syrinx. It can leave a mark on the bone because of structures that we haven't talked about yet, but we should. I guess we just lead into it. The other thing that is an anatomical feature of birds that is very associated with birds is the presence of air sacs, right? So these are air-filled diverticula or epithelial structures, basically these thin tissues that invade the body cavity. They come off of either the nose or the ears or the lungs. Most of the air sacs of birds are coming off the lungs, and they're expanding out, and they expand out to such an extent that they actually eat into the bones of their skeleton, which is largely responsible for what helps hollow out the bones in birds. But it also it just turns their whole skeleton into like this fancy air-filled chamber. And one of those in relation to this the syrinx is a sternal air sac that sorry, not sternal, a clavicular air sacs that come off the syrinx directly. So they have been used to hypothesize they have been associated with the presence of a syrinx. It works that way in birds. There is I want to say it's a Cenozoic bird that we found. I have to look it up again. That has evidence for a syrinx, in part because of that. Whether or not we see it in anything beyond birds is really not certain. There is a sauropod Aerostion that has a clavicular air sac or evidence for that. But whether or not that is because they have a syrinx or because that just happens to be where one of these diverticula from the lung came from is harder to tell. So there is some slight osteological evidence that you can bring back into the fossil record, but because of where we're certain syrinxes live, it's harder to extend it beyond just outside of birds.
I see.
And so if you have that image way back, it's the image of a duck filled with latex, so it's blue on the inside.
Let me have a look. Yeah, I found it.
Yeah, it's from paleontologist Patrick O'Connor and Leon Claessens, where they talked about air sacs in birds. And so all that blue you're seeing was from a latex injection of the air sacs in a duck. So they filled the airways with liquid latex and let it cure to form basically like a giant balloon. And so that let them see all the air sacs that are in the body, which is what you're seeing right there. And then if we want to do a little more up-to-date one, there is the other image that should be right above it that shows a skeleton and then a bunch of multicolored stuff inside of it.
I think it's the one that has like a bright green, like acidic bright green with some purple and turquoise. Yeah, okay, got it.
So that's from Adam Lawson and Emma Schachner, and they are looking at the lungs of a parrot. So in the middle image, the lungs have been made clear so that you can sort of see inside and see all the bronchi going out. And then everything else around it are the air sacs. So all the air sacs that make up the lungs. So you can see in a bird's, the lungs are small and rigid, so they don't take up a lot of space. But then the air sacs that come off of those lungs are huge and just eat up all kinds of space.
So basically, the image B and C are showing us what's inside, while the image A is just showing how it fits inside the skeleton itself.
Yes. So you can see the extent to the air sacs in a modern bird, and that's not even the full extent of it, right? That's just the major air sacs, not the ones that fill in all the individual vertebrae or go out into the limb bones. So birds really just, their lungs kind of went crazy inside of their body and just expanded out into all these different places. Air sacs in birds, especially the big green one there, that abdominal air sac, they're going to be important for pushing air through the lungs. So bringing air in when they expand the air sacs and then pushing the air out when they contract it. All the other air sacs are mostly just dead end spaces that are just kind of there. Like I said, very extensive in birds. It's interesting. That is as extensive as it is. Definitely it's something that they inherited from dinosaur ancestors, because we know a lot of theropods and sauropods had extensive air sac distribution too. But birds really took this filling of the skeleton with air to a whole new level and have it just hugely dispersed. In some birds, they only, if you carefully dissect away, especially I think it's like pelicans a lot, they almost have like a chainmail armor of just bubble wrap. And it's just such thin air sacs that just cover basically the entire body. So it is something else in birds.
So
yeah, so they use air sacs
for vocalizing too.
And that is for the vocalizing. So because of the way the syrinx is located, birds can, at least the birds that decide to go that route, can make sound continuously, right? So they can make sound as they're breathing out and make sound as they're breathing in. So that makes for extremely long and complicated songs in different species. In comparison to a human, because we talk a lot, we mostly talk when we're expiring, so when we're breathing out. We don't usually talk too much when you breathe in. You can talk a bit when you breathe in, but it sounds weird.
Mm-hmm. I noticed that. I was just I turned off my microphone and I just about actually tried it because I just couldn't help it, and yeah, it's very weird.
Right. We don't get the same amount of force, and our vocal cords really just aren't really geared towards making sound that way.
It just really doesn't seem like it works properly. Like I feel so weird trying it. But yeah, the other thing I wanted to point out, and I've noticed this, that is it true, at least according to what we know, is my observation in fact correct, that as humans we tend to, each individual tends to have like a unique voice sort of frequency pattern, etc., which is why we end up with mostly very different voices, where some may sound similar but still are different from each other, while in case of many other animal species that produce vocals, they tend to sound a lot more similar, or if not identical, to one another.
I think part of it is because humans are really good at recognizing things that other humans say. So it's easier for us to point out the subtle differences that make each person's voice unique. There does seem to be what sounds like more similar sounds in individuals of other animals. Though there are studies of things like whale song and different bird songs where you can, and even some crocodilians, identify unique sonic signatures for an individual, but it's more subtle than we give it credit for. So it's something that maybe other species, other members of that species can recognize real well, and we just don't notice it. Or it could be that they are just looking at different things, and that having a carbon copy sound doesn't matter as much. That'll depend on your species.
Sure. So basically, it does actually indicate that there is enough variation, even though we are not always able to pick it up with our hearing in particular.
Yeah, because we're not a bird, so
Yeah,
it
that's true.
means less. It means less to us. So even like you have to really study the birds, like be into that to really notice these subtle differences. What else?
There's something else I wanted to ask you, by the way, in case you may have heard of any of this sort. Has there ever been any way to experiment with maybe some humans who are very skilled at imitating sounds to attempt to reproduce certain bird songs to generate some kind of response or a reaction from the bird of certain species? Like as
as
a way to talk to them, if you will.
I'm not sure how well it works talking to them, but you can make sounds that are similar enough that they attract those birds and that you can get a response from those birds, right? There are people who are good at making bird calls. Duck hunters can buy duck calls to get the attention of other ducks. So there are ways to make it work. Even if we go outside of birds and back to alligators again, you can create a bellowing sort of standoff between an alligator and like a tuba player. Or if you just have a good recording of an alligator making a bellow, you can get them to start going off that way. So you can do that. You can get the attention of those species. Whether or not they understand why you're doing it, I don't know. But you can definitely get a response from it.
So one other question I wanted to ask is to do with birds of prey, and I wanted to explore this area that, you know how we always see birds of prey as those really good, well, generally very effective hunters when it comes to taking out small mammals and things like that, maybe other birds too. But do they themselves potentially have any predators that they are in danger from when they happen to be on land, for example? Say, for example, can a fox take down a golden eagle that has just landed and potentially might be oblivious to them encroaching? If it were to be distracted and the fox decides to charge, is it actually possible, or did we never actually see that?
I mean, we don't see it. It's not impossible. You could be that crazy fox that wants to give it a shot. It could work if it's a young eagle, if it's a sick eagle, if it's a particularly large or ornery fox. It's another one of those things where the scenario and the context are so important to figure it out that it's really hard to say. I think that in majority of cases, a fox is going to not want to play around with an eagle, especially since a lot of eagles will eat foxes. But
we do know that the fox can be targeted by an eagle from the air, but what about if the eagle has landed, and how effective would that be in defending itself from a fox if the fox surprises it? That's what I'm actually most curious about.
If we're talking about like an eagle with a broken wing, it could be in trouble. It could have a bad day, and it could fall to a fox. I mean, they have very strong, extremely strong leg claws, so they could still put up a heck of a fight and do a lot of damage. A lot of the damage that comes from these birds of prey does come from those strong talons. So
all it needs to do is airlift itself a little bit to utilize them and just basically just keep
or
going.
fall on its back.
Or fall on its back, yeah.
Yeah, you do the bird equivalent of Krav Maga.
Like there are some, I think rabbits do that as well, actually. They fall on the back and they use their limbs to, repel. Because they do have claws on their limbs, by the way, in case people don't know that hares and rabbits, I think they do have those means of defending themselves from some predators.
Yeah, and that makes sense, right?
It's pretty nasty
That's
too.
where the power is. So you just gotta angle it.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess we are obviously going to be going into this territory where is for the predator is to assess whether or not this particular item of prey is worth risking its own well-being, especially if it happens that if this fox is a male who is hunting for food while the vixen is waiting with the babies in a den or something, and then
Yeah.
if the fox, does not, if the male basically fails in a sense that it gets badly damaged and ends up basically dying itself, then the vixen will probably take a long time to figure out that basically her mate is dead and there won't be no food. So, yeah.
Oh, one thing we can talk about since we're talking on diet. So you see that one bird I have flying over the river?
Let me bring it up again. I'm pretty sure I brought it up
As-
already just to let people to look at it. But yes, it's the kind of black grayish, right?
Yeah,
Raincops or something.
that is, yeah, it's a great skimmer. So that's raincops. Bring that one up just because since we were talking pterosaurs earlier, there, even though it's hard to say whether or not some as dark is, we're doing carrion feeding because that's harder to tell. We do have a better idea that pterosaurs probably weren't doing skim feeding, which is what this great skimmer is doing. So that is where you dip your lower jaw into the water as you're swimming along, and you just sort of catch whatever you catch along the way and lift yourself up. That is a very specialized technique that requires strong neck muscles and a strong jaw. And great skimmers are, the skimmer group entirely is the only bird group that even does this. All other birds will just peck at the water or dive into the water to go after food. So it's a unique feature that requires some unique biomechanics that we don't see, certainly not across pterosaurs. We might find one in a specific pterosaur, but it would be a rare event. So all those old video or images of like pteranodon flying over the ocean and then like dipping its beak in to get some food, probably not a thing that happened.
Yeah.
It's
And,
not like that.
Yeah, I was gonna say that it's probably not gonna be quite like that. And
Yeah, other things with feeding, just quick mention, birds have cranial kinesis, so they're able to move their skulls in a way that is much more mobile than what we see in a lot of other animals. It's really birds and lizards that are able to do this kind of bit where they're able to really manipulate their jaws in a weird way. And it gives them more dexterity with their food. So if you ever watch a parrot eating a nut and cracking the nut open to get at the seed, that's a good example of their cranial kinesis at work. So they're able to
Yeah, I've seen
maneuver
it,
their
yeah.
upper jaw a lot more than you would expect, and just like flip that food around and pop the seed out. You can also see this with songbirds at a bird feeder if you ever want. If you just take a closer look, you can see how they're able to really just like rip a seed out of a nut or its casing and just leave the shell behind. Very fast. Yeah.
I've also seen how quickly they can clap, the parrots, they clap their jaws. One time is because when I was in I think it was in Hyde Park, I believe it was in Hyde Park here in London. There is a spot specifically where there are some parrot species which were introduced here from Australia. They're like these green ones with bright orange beaks, which I don't know if it's helpful description, but someday I might just show you the picture and you might probably know which species they are.
Sounds like a lorikeet.
Possibly, yeah. And they're not very big. They're sort of like very, for a parrot, probably like an average-ish on the lower end size, perhaps on the lower average size. Like they're bigger than many other parrots, but they have a very plain, generally very plain green kind of color with bright orange beaks, if I remember correctly. And the interesting thing I noticed was how when I held an apple in my palm and it landed on my forearm, basically it was when it was biting, some of them even landed on my fingers, and that was really uncomfortable because of their claws like almost digging into it because they're trying to hold on while they are trying to eat that apple. And it's just the amount of this kind of like very rapid, like that sort of sound. Sorry if you have to hear it, I don't know how to describe it, like this kind of munching sound, and it's so quickly, and it just I just noticed how quickly they're able to use them. like that. And
There you go.
I think this
Well,
might be the parrot you were on about. I'm not 100% sure, but let me just bring it up on the screen. But I believe this is our culprit here.
yeah, these they're very they're like the equivalent of pigeons in Australia.
Yeah, and they got somehow introduced here in the UK, and they do like to sometimes when they fly around, in like flocks from tree to a tree, they tend to basically like make loud, vocalizations, just screeches mostly.
Oh yeah. Yep.
Nothing special, just very noisy from time to time, and but they are quite fun, and when it comes to interacting with them, and especially close up, they look pretty interesting. Their eyes, especially, are very interesting looking with the amount of gradient and colors that they have in them, and as you can see even in this picture, and yes, the rate at which they basically clap those jaws is insane. It's so fast when they were biting and munching down that apple. It's like it almost looked like it was some kind of a machine trying to recycle it, or like a shredder of some kind. And the other one that was very funny is when I brought some seeds to the pond, and there were a bunch of Canada geese, which were obviously, it seems like they're always hungry anyway, they always like to eat. And some of them came up to me, they just started eating off my palm, and it was just really hilarious how they were just quickly grabbing those seeds, and it looked like just, I don't know, it was both funny, but it was fascinating at the same time. The speed at which they do it is insane as well.
Very cool. So I do have to wrap up and get ready to go soon.
Yeah, I was gonna say that this is generally the length that.
But this is exactly what I was expecting, because we get more into the weeds with really cool stuff, and just like, oh, I want to talk about this, I want to talk about that. Two other things I want to comment on. One is regarding anatomy. We have recently learned that birds' brains, which are smaller than a similar sized mammal brain, and as such, because of sort of mammal chauvinism, we used to think that birds weren't all that intelligent. We have since learned that bird neurons are more densely packed than mammal neurons. So a given bird has, for the same size mammal, even though it has a smaller brain, it will have an equivalent or even greater amount of neurons packed in that same space, which means more opportunities for connections, which is why we've recently come to recognize that birds actually are a lot more intelligent than we're giving them credit for. It's probably related to the fact that they're able to do all these really complicated songs, interactions with each other, that kind of drives some of that brain evolution. But it's worth noting that we have recently learned that bird brains, even though they are smaller than mammal brains, they are denser, so they can still fit a lot of the same stuff in there. And there is preliminary work that is still not out yet that suggests that crocodilian brains, at least, are doing something similar.
Could this suggest that dinosaurs potentially could be considered as candidates for a similar pattern too?
It is bringing us towards that direction, yeah. At the very least, it suggests that something that we probably should be aware of anyway is that you really shouldn't use brain size as your only proxy for the intelligence of an animal, because there's a lot more going on there.
Right.
And lastly, I'm going to send you this image.
Yeah,
because it's
let's
a
have a
good
look.
one to add. It is... Go. This is the arrow stork of Mecklenburg.
Okay,
It is
let me bring
museum
this up
piece,
on the...
and it was used as this specimen was used as an example of, or not example, but was used to show that birds migrated, because these storks that were coming from, I think it was from England, or from Europe, were going down to Africa in the summertime or in the wintertime, and then we'd come back. And so the hypothesis was that these birds were migrating down there in the winter to stay warm, or to find more food during the winter months, and then come back up. But it was only ever hypothesized until someone started finding that these storks, a couple of them would come back with arrows in them because they were being hunted by the locals there. And turns out birds have a very high tolerance for pain, and so they would get hit with the arrow, not die, and just fly off with an arrow. And to this day, you can still see this around where birds get hit with arrows or darts, or they'll wind up with a stick stuck through their
Slingshots and
neck.
stuff like that, yeah.
And they'll just, and as long as it doesn't kill them, they will surprisingly survive and just live with that thing stuck at them for like the remainder of their life.
Yikes.
So
It's a veteran. It's a badass veteran stork, basically.
yeah, it's
With-
just
with
an
wounds to
impressive, you know,
tell
like
the tale.
testament to how much of a beating birds can take and still keep on going.
That's true.
Which is kind of just like a sauropsid thing, really, because right, we were talked about the crazy damage that crocodilians can go through and keep going. Same thing with like turtles and lizards losing entire limbs or chunks of their body and just keeping on moving. So,
Well, we do see some evidence of that in dinosaurs too, where it shows that there was a sign of healing. So that means that they didn't die of that wound specifically. It might have they might have lived for a little while before,
Yeah.
obviously, they passed away for
we
whatever
talked
reason.
classic example of that, right, was Sue that had her broken leg. The hypothesis being that, oh, well, she was being cared for that entire time, or she just waited it out and then just kept on going because apparently, just like other sauropsids, dinosaurs were built tough.
Yeah, we also don't know a whole lot how much were they able to reserve their fat in order to last them for a long time in case they suffer some kind of damage before they recover,
Mhm.
before they need to hunt again. So that could be another thing to consider. But obviously, we will definitely get to dinosaurs. So who are watching, be
Yes.
patient. And I think
That
we
would
can
be-
wrap this one up for now.
I think so.
And once we get off the record, whenever we will continue communicating, and we will decide which section will be the next installment of this segment, because the segment is promising to be quite long and exciting in that sense. If you want to listen to these kind of podcasts and learn more, you know, ranging from the general and into the slightly more specific information about these animals. So
You know
I-
how it
no.
goes. If you
Go
like
ahead.
it, leave a comment below, like, share, and subscribe, all that stuff.
Absolutely, thank you very much, and I absolutely love the fact that Jay is also using this, invitation, because he's technically part of my crew in a way of this channel and this community, both on Discord and here as well. So thank you, Jay. Thanks for the, well, I don't know what you were gonna call it, invitation.
Yeah, happy to be here. I'm glad we're doing it. I hope people are enjoying it. But yeah, leave us your thoughts.
All right, thanks very much, guys. And if you are new, then definitely check the previous installments and the videos where I first introduced Jay to this. I should really say Dr. Jason Bourke, but since we are kind of like, in the same team and buddies now, then I suppose.
It's all-
Yeah.
All in the description box. It's fine.
It's all in the description box anyway, yeah, so you know that who he is, and that he is, in fact, a paleontologist as well, even though we're talking like we're buddies. But, yeah, thanks very much, guys, for watching. I hope you like this kind of format, and if you would like to, please also leave some comments with suggestions, with questions, maybe we can include them in the next segments. And also just share your ideas and stories wherever appropriate in that sense, in terms of what you know about birds and things that you have encountered that are very interesting about birds. And,
Yeah, because we missed stuff. Because
100%.
we're always gonna miss stuff.
There's always going to be at least one person there in the comments who's going to point something out that's going to be like, oh my god, why did we not bring this up? So there's going to be one of those, at least one, I would imagine. So please do, if you have that kind of information or story to tell, please do tell us. We would love to hear it. And on that note, shall we say goodbyes, I guess?
Yeah, we'll see you later.
See you later. Bye-bye.